Oh, come on.
Welcome to What the Hell is Wrong with Us? George Lee and Kit Power in conversation. Tonight, Clive Barker's Weaveworld. Hello everybody, hi, welcome back. Welcome back to something new. Never mind what the hell is wrong with us, what the hell is this, Kit? Well, let me explain. Basically, Robocop's on hiatus. It's not finished. I am coming back to it. I'm eager and anxious to get back to watching the film again. But a couple of things have conspired to make that very difficult lately. Some of it's been just simple scheduling because of how things are going with the writing at the moment. I've kind of had to prioritize that. I've also had some ongoing technical issues that meant that I made a couple of attempts to record the show that didn't work. And I found that kind of intensely demoralizing. So watching Robocop with Kit Power hasn't been abandoned, but it is on hiatus. What I'm planning to do actually is some shows where I watch the Ken Russell movie Tommy, because as you know, I've got a book coming out on the subject of the film. So I'm going to record some commentary tracks with a few people in the run up to the release of that book and after that for a few months. And then the plan is to return to Robocop before the end of the year. Hopefully by then all the technical issues will be ironed out and I'll be back on the horse. So if you are a Robocop fan and that's what you're tuning in for, sorry, but I hope you do decide to stick around for this, because this is what I've been doing in the meantime. So some of you may remember that I tried to set up a second strand of podcast called Kit and It, and my first guest was George Lee. Well, that conversation was incredibly good, and we both enjoyed it a huge amount. And of course, George had been on the show before, both with Robocop and Hellbound Hellraiser 2. And off the back of those experiences, we decided what we'd like to do is actually start a new podcast between the two of us, where we talked about some of the pop culture influences and things that had really influenced us and made us think as writers, as creative types. What were those kind of key early influences? I mean, those of you who have followed my writing know this is a kind of an obsession of mine anyway. I mean, 5 years of my life in horror and counting, where I've been kind of excavating the experiences of my childhood and trying to make sense of them in terms of the impact they had on me. But it's different when you're in conversation with someone else, and it's different too because we're talking about a much wider range of things than that. We're not always necessarily going to be talking about horror per se. We cast our net with this deliberately as wide as we possibly could. And, we've covered a lot of different subjects. We've covered, comic books, novels, music is coming up. Video games have featured quite prominently. So we're really kind of, we deliberately wanted it to be as open as possible. And to have as wide a range of subject matter that we'd be covering as possible. And we just kind of, we're recording about once every 2 or 3 weeks at the moment, whenever we get the opportunity, basically. Conversations typically an hour to, hour and a half to 2.5 hours, somewhere around there. And it's just, I mean, the only real rule is it has to be something at least one of us is incredibly enthusiastic about, normally both of us. Anyway, so that's the series. What the hell is wrong with us? George has been putting out on YouTube, but he very kindly gave me permission to throw it together as a podcast as well. And that's what you're listening to. So this is episode 1 of What the Hell is Wrong with Us? George Lee and I on the subject of the Clive Barker novel Weaveworld. I don't propose to do anything else because the rest of the podcast speaks for itself. So, I hope you enjoy this. I hope you don't feel disappointed. As I say, Robocop is coming back. There'll be some Tommy commentaries coming in the meantime. But it's been way, way, way too long since I got to talk to you. And, as we produce these, and they are fun content, I thought I'd throw them up. So I hope you enjoy it. And without further ado, here are George and I on Clive Barker's Weaveworld.
Just out of interest, how did you find Weaveworld this time round?
Yeah. Oh man. So I'll very briefly set the background. So
Okay.
I read Weaveworld last when I was a teenager. I can be no more precise than that.
Oh, and it was sort of vague. You can't remember what?
No.
Interesting.
I'm almost certain I was still at secondary school, so 14, 15 at the oldest.
Wow.
I went through a brief but very intense Barker period around then.
I can imagine. Was that when you first sort of discovered him?
Yeah, it was, and it was actually, I've got to say, it was my dad. So having devoured most of my dad's Stephen King collection, I was casting around, and I think Weaveworld is the one he gave me. I think Dad
Why?
said read Weaveworld.
This is so fucking weird. You'd think, wouldn't you? These stories about parents giving their kids books to read. Barker.
Yeah,
You'd think that wouldn't happen often, and yet it happens all the time. It seems.
I mean, I think so. I think I must have been at least 14, but bear in mind by then, I'd read it at the age of 11, and I'd worked through a lot of King since, so he knew I was consuming adult grade fare.
So basically, the damage had already been done.
Yeah, exactly. He wasn't going to get the blame, was he? At this point, he could just say, "Well, all right then,
whatever. What's that going to do on top of all that? Who cares at this point?"
And I think, and I remember, because in very short succession, I read Weaveworld and I read The Great and Secret Show and I read Magica, and because I read them all together, the three books have kind of become jumbled in my mind a little bit.
I can see that, because they're all very quite complex mythologies.
Yeah, and they all what they have in common, I think, is the evocation of another reality. That's the thing that I'd say all three of the books do in very, very different ways.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
But they definitely have that thread, and I think at the time, I think Magica's the one I read last, and I think that's the one that I kind of loved the most. But Weaveworld as the first, I do remember just being utterly stunned by it, just completely ensorcelled and bewitched. It was just, it just swept me along. My memory is I read it very quickly as well.
Likewise.
Yeah,
I think. I mean, I read it earlier than you. I read it when I was 11. Which probably not wise, it probably explains a lot, but I do recall it was one of those books, how things often do obsess you when you're about that age, and you can't leave them alone. I believe I read Weaveworld in a couple of days, if that. I just could not stop reading it. It completely enveloped my being for a brief period.
I can't, I mean, to be honest, it's the kind of thing, I mean, I don't have the kind of life anymore where I could spend a weekend reading a book, but I can well imagine that because it's so interesting. The prose is just lethally easy to read on a sentence level. It's one of the things that I found incredibly impressive this time through was the simplicity of the prose itself. The concepts are anything but simple. The concepts have incredible depth, but he does it in very kind of, for want of a better phrase, plain English. The prose on a word selection sentence level is fantastic.
Barker's always been phenomenal at that, though. He's of a literary tradition it's very peculiarly British in its own way.
Yeah, it is.
In the sense that it's of the sort of Wildian, almost romantic poet tradition. There's very much an element of Blake in the way he writes. There is this poetic quality, but at the same time, he has this capacity for exploiting the ambiguity of words. Yeah. And of choosing words that are so apposite. Yeah. Apposite in the sentences in which they occur that they are simultaneously poetic but without being flowery.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing for me. What I was so impressed with was just how incredibly grounded the language is. The thing I think that I hadn't appreciated about Barker, hadn't absorbed really fully, because we've talked about this before. You read a book as a reader, you read it as a writer, it changes.
It's a totally different experience. Yeah, it's totally different experience.
And one of the things that kept coming back to me on this reread as I was going through was just how grounded the prose was in the visceral, the viscerally real. Even when he's dealing with
sensuality.
Yes,
He is a
exactly.
past master, isn't he, at that? He does this thing,
Yeah.
actually. He does it in Weaveworld. He does it in a lot of his books, and I envy it completely. He does this thing where, at the beginning of the book, he takes a god's eye view. So he is the narrator. He's looking down
Yeah.
upon, literally
Yeah.
looking down upon events. And then he carries you down into the world, which is a
Yeah.
very real world. It's Liverpool in the 1980s, in the
Yeah,
late
that's right.
1980s. And it's very gritty, it's very dirty, it's very grimy, it's very viscerally real. And suddenly
Yeah.
you're inside the head of a character. You're inside the head of a character seamlessly, by the way, completely seamlessly. You've gone from being God on high to being this guy, just being nobody on the
Yeah.
ground, tending to his pigeons, tending to his dad's pigeons, and suddenly that you are in a familiar world. And
Yeah.
he describes it in this way whereby it is like it is real. It is like he
Yeah.
is. He writes in a realist way, but he uses realist prose to describe fantastical things.
And the thing that he also does is he manages to somehow simultaneously infuse the mundane with a kind of spark of something.
Yeah, I mean, this is
without
something.
without sacrificing the mundanity of it.
Yeah,
it's a really
such
fascinating.
It's such a bizarre thing, but what he's managed to do, certainly in Weaveworld, it's something he does in a lot of his work, certainly from around that era. He is trying to create this dichotomy between the real and the imagined, and then after establishing that, he dissolves it. He breaks it
Yeah.
down on the level of both story and prose.
Yeah.
And so the nature of the prose actually reflects the themes of the story. It's so
Yeah.
bloody clever, and it's
Yeah.
enviable. I mean, reading it as a reader, it is one of those books. It is what I'm evangelistic about this book. As anyone who's been on my YouTube channel knows, I'm totally evangelistic about this book. I am. You will read it and you will go forth and love it. You will adore it. It will change your life.
Absolutely.
And that's the effect that it has on you as a reader. I actually haven't met anyone who it hasn't affected very profoundly.
Yeah.
One way or another. The only person, ironically, who I've met who didn't enjoy it was the person who gave it to me, which was my mother.
Oh, really?
My mum is, as fans of this channel will know, people who listen to me will know, my mother is an inveterate fan of all media. She likes a lot of stuff. Barker is a bit too much for her.
Okay.
Barker's a little bit
That's
too
interesting.
abstruse. He's a little bit too weird. She loves King. She is
Right.
the biggest Stephen King fan I've ever met, probably barring you, I imagine.
Well, possibly.
Possibly,
I don't know.
you know.
Yeah.
But Weaveworld, her words to me when she handed me the hardback that I've got right here, right next to me, it's still
Right.
here, it's tattered, it's dog-eared, it's falling to bits, were, this is a bit weird for me, but you'll like it.
Nice.
You know?
Well, and how right she was, clearly.
Well, mothers know us very well, don't they?
Yeah, they do.
For
Yeah,
better
they do.
or worse, they know us very well. And she was absolutely correct, because up until that point, my experience of fantasy was largely more traditional.
Right.
It was Tolkien, it was C.S.
Right.
Lewis, it was Alan Garner, it was The Weird Stone of Brisingamen, it was Elidor, it was that kind of thing. I'd read a little bit more of the more abstruse stuff, but not much.
So that's really interesting, because that sounds like we have very similar backgrounds to that. So by the time I'd picked up Weaveworld, as a child, I'd read the entire Narnia Chronicles. And so when I was 7, it was the last. 7 was the last winter we didn't own a television, so we owned a television set by the summer of me being 8 years old. I know that because Trial of the Time Lord was on Doctor Who, and that's the first televised Who I ever watched on a black and white telly, which actually improved it, as you may imagine.
Well, yeah.
It was actually better.
Hide some of the the masking tape and the
Yeah,
glue
quite.
tack
And-
they're using to hold
and
everything
frankly,
together.
Colin Baker's trousers.
And that too, yes.
So they look a lot better in grayscale. But so that means that the winter of me being 7 into spring, was the winter that we read Lord of the Rings,
Wow.
and it was our nightly ritual. And we literally read a page, a page a turn each, taking it in turns to read it. and read the entire. Now, I've never managed to go back to Lord of the Rings. I've read The Hobbit.
It's
a few
interesting.
times.
I mean, I was a big Tolkien fan as a kid.
Right.
As a kid, I was a huge Tolkien fan. My mother showed me the Ralph Bakshi cartoon.
Oh yeah,
and
yeah, sure.
then she gave me her dog-eared, tattered, falling to bits copy of The Lord of the Rings, which is I still have somewhere, but it is like held together literally with tape. And I devoured that as I think I must have been 8 when I read that, and it became that book that I read once a year every year.
Okay.
Up until Weaveworld. Up until Weaveworld. I mean, I was totally obsessed with The Lord of the Rings. I had so much stuff. I had the books. I started getting like the big anniversary editions for birthdays and things like that. I had all sorts of crap relating to it, and I loved it so much. But then I read Weaveworld at the age of 11, and it changed everything. On every level, it changed my preconceptions of what fantastical or abstruse fiction could do. The prose, I mean, the prose of The Lord of the Rings, although I appreciate The Lord of the Rings on a mythological level for what it did, it's unreadable.
Yeah, it's tough.
It's unreadable. It's
heavy going.
leaden, is what it is.
I mean, oddly, the Hobbit is a lot easier. The Hobbit's actually quite. So it's not like it couldn't do it.
No, the Hobbit's
that's the weird
kind of
part, isn't
rollicking adventure.
Yeah,
it's loads of fun, and it's very compared to The Lord of the Rings, it's incredibly streamlined, very easy to read, and it has that wonderful sort of fairy tale quality where the prose is simple and elegant, and it just does its job as a story. The Lord of the Rings is just a totally different entity.
Yeah, I mean, in fairness as well to Tolkien, I mean, The Lord of the Rings, this is based on the memory of when I was 7, again, just to flag that up. My memory is that the difference in tone reflects at least partly the fact that The Lord of the Rings is a very dark story.
Oh, God, yeah.
It's a very doom-laden, kind of heavy... Yeah.
Tonally, the two books are very, 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 very different indeed. I imagine it's why they struggled with the adaptations, the film adaptations of The Hobbit, because they were trying to recreate the darkness of the Lord of the Rings.
They were trying to grimdark The Hobbit. Like, why would you do that?
Exactly. And there are elements of fantasy darkness in The Hobbit, but there's no great stakes in The Hobbit, No. It's an adventure story. That's what it is. It's an adventure story about going to steal gold from a dragon. That's what it's about.
Right. Yeah.
The Lord of the Rings is heavily mythological and tied into like the entire mythology of Middle-earth and of the wider realm of Arda that Tolkien created. It's the last gospel in the Bible of Middle-earth. It's a huge piece of work, of which the stakes are much greater if you happen to know the background, if you've read the Silmarillion and the Unremembered Tales and all this stuff, the background of the entire world. It suddenly becomes this immense piece of work, which, again, I do appreciate in terms of the detail and the imagination, the mythology building, the languages, the raw stuff that's gone into it. But as a piece of writing, I actually can't read it anymore. Yeah.
No, it's hard work.
I've tried. I've tried to go back to it and try to not to rekindle that old affection, because you can never go home again. You can never recapture that lightning in a bottle. But I can't actually even engage with it anymore.
No, and it's interesting because on a similar note, I mean, I've read a few of the Narnia books to my little girl now, and whilst there isn't the same problem with the prose. The prose is pretty crisp, but the gender roles stuff
and the other stuff that goes with it. Have you got to
really
A Horse and His Boy yet?
No, I've got Prince Caspian sitting on the shelf, and I keep finding excuses not to read it.
There's a reason why no one ever adapted that book. There's a reason why they skip completely to the Silver Chair.
Right.
It's awful. It's so bloody racist, and I don't mean on the level of I'm a lefty liberal gay guy racist. I mean it is actually like all white English speaking people are good.
Yes.
All basically Islamic people are bad.
Yeah.
It's that.
Okay.
it's appallingly bad.
Sure.
And that is a problem, yeah. But it's ironic, though, isn't it? Because I've actually read interviews with Barker about Weaveworld and about his work, his wider work, and he has always described the fantasy he was trying to create as influenced by people like C.S. Lewis, who, of course, whether you agree with his particular metaphysics or not, it's metaphysical fiction. You know, it's trying to say something. And now, for my money, I powerfully disagree with the metaphysics of Narnia. I think it's actually quite corrupt, and I think it's quite grotesque. Certainly at the end. But I also think the books are stronger for having it.
Oh, absolutely. But I think what's so interesting about that observation for me is that Weaveworld feels to me one of the very strong threads in Weaveworld is it's so clearly a very conscious and respectful rejection of that metaphysics.
Oh, absolutely. It's dynamically similar. In the sense that you have a fantastical world that's stepped into from a quote-unquote real world. The thing that Barker does, and I believe it's entirely conscious, is that, he dissolves that distinction. You have those wonderful little lines, you know, where the seer kind first turn up, and they're talking about raptures, which is the wonderful term for magic in this world. Yeah. But to them, one of them says they shrug whenever the matter of it comes up, and whenever human beings are like mystified or in awe of it. One of them actually says it's no more miraculous to us than the fact that bread rises. It's what we do.
Yeah.
You know? And I love that. It's somehow the book manages to sort of it domesticizes magic and miracles, and yet it maintains the wonder of them.
I tell you what it makes me think of. I think for me the underlying principle that expresses is the idea that what it is it's a fundamental rejection of the supernatural. And what I mean by that is it's saying, like, it's not saying that magic, for want of a better word, doesn't exist. It's saying it does exist, but it's a natural force.
Yes, it's not. It isn't. There is that
it's
dichotomy.
Of the world.
Yes.
It's not beyond it. Yeah.
It is simply a phenomena that we have no context for, and therefore no explanation for. And he does that all the way through. And I have noticed that has led to Weaveworld being very difficult to classify, as a lot of his books are. If you go into a bookstore even now, and you will find Barker, because he's been in publication like forever, you'll find him scattered all over the place. You'll find a lot of him in horror, you'll find him in science fiction, you'll find him in fantasy, you'll find him in children's books, you'll find him in the general fiction section, because people don't know how to classify him. And that, again, is very deliberate. There was that, his career was kickstarted basically by Stephen King. You know, Stephen King wrote, he read the books of Blood, and he wrote to his publishers that wonderful letter that they then quoted
famous blurb
on every Barker book that was ever published ever since, where he said, "I have seen the future of horror, and his name is Clive Barker." There was an interview with Doug Bradley, who is not only the guy who plays Pinhead in the Hellraiser books, he's actually Clive Barker's school friend. They've known one another forever. And Bradley said that when Clive read that, he was, of course, very grateful, because it's such a huge compliment to be paid from someone who was in King's status at the time. This was in the 1980s, so King's star was in the total ascendance. But he also knew that Barker was thinking privately, he would never say it, but privately, the hell I am. That's never what he wanted. It's never. But he was already
he was already going beyond it, wasn't
Absolutely.
he? In his imagination.
I mean, he established with the Books of Blood that he could do this stuff. It's sort of a way in, and he got an audience on the back of it, which was the established horror audience. But even in those books, he's already starting to transgress. He's already moving away. So, I mean, I actually revisited the Books of Blood recently, and I did a podcast about it earlier, about how, coming back to them, you can see just how abstruse they were for the time. No one amongst his contemporaries was writing stories like he was at the time. And that's not to say that I believe that Barker's stories are inherently superior, although for my subjective tastes they are.
Sure.
It's the fact that he was constantly thrashing against the bounds of prescribed genre, ultimately, and of tradition. And that is something that is exemplified by books like Weaveworld.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether I think Weaveworld was the first one. You had the Damnation game, which is still very much in the realm of horror. It's still very much a story that feels like an evolution of the Books of Blood.
Right.
And then you have Weaveworld dropping, and Weaveworld just blasts it apart because it is not I doubt it's what people expected. I imagine it was a massive gamble at the time.
I can't even imagine. I mean, the size of the manuscript alone.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's
you have to get,
isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think you have to get to a certain level in publishing before you're allowed to give a book like that to a publisher.
Especially if you've already established yourself. Because again, this is, publishers, if you manage to get some success with a big publisher and you get money, then obviously they want you to keep producing the same thing.
Right. I mean, even someone as big as King talks about that, right? Remember I mean, it's one of the wonderful things in that the preface to Different Seasons. Where he's talking about, like, the conversation with his publisher about, could I put out a collection of novellas that maybe weren't completely horror?
Yeah.
And his agent just kind of sighing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, really?
And it's amazing, isn't it? Because these guys are huge.
And I'm like, that's exactly. It's like, that's Stephen King.
Yeah, their
and you're
names
sighing
can carry. Their names will carry a project, whether it's any good or not.
Exactly.
It's as simple as that. It will outsell almost anyone on the market out there, with the possible exceptions of people like Rowling and maybe George R. Martin now.
Yeah.
But again, this is something you see a lot. Barker writes a lot of stuff for kids as well. But he was almost not allowed to do that. His first children's book, The Thief of Always, he sold to his publisher for a dime.
That is. I mean, we should. I should revisit that, and we should do that one
totally, it's brilliant.
I have very fond memories of that book. Very vague, but fond.
It's such a lovely book. He's actually a stunning children's writer. And when you read books like Weaveworld, as we were discussing earlier, where the prose it's written in this kind of fairy tale way, where it is kind of simple and it is kind of pared down, and it even has like the timbre and rhythm of a fairy story.
Absolutely,
you can see why he would be good at that. And it has all of that wonderful, weird ambiguity and darkness you'd expect of a Barker story, but reconfigured to be palatable for a younger audience.
And it's interesting that you say that this is the first of that, because I always think, I mean, I know that they're not actually connected as stories in any way, but I always think of this one, Great and Secret Show and Imagica, as kind of a loose trilogy in sense of feel and theme. You know what I mean?
Weaveworld is the one that kind of stands apart from them because it is technically not part of the Books of the Art, but I've read this book so many times. This is the book I've read most in my life. I read it at least once a year every year and have done since I was 11. It is, and sometimes I've read it and then I finished it and picked it up again and read it again because I love it so much. I love it so much. And there are some vague references to Barker's other mythologies in it. There is a point when Immaculata, who is one of my favourite Barker creations in all of his fiction. I love Immaculata. She is wonderful, one of the triune goddesses, but that archetype taken and completely reconfigured in a very Barkerian way. So she's the maiden of that group, and whereas in the classical triune, the maiden is the thing of milk and sighs. She's almost like the conquest for the knight, isn't she? She is not that here. Bloody hell, is she not that here? He's taken the purity of the virgin, of the the male prescribed virgin, and he's turned it on its head. He's made it so that she's not a virgin to be worshipped and revered and conquered by men. She's a virgin because she's fucking disgusted by everything around her. Nothing is good enough. Nothing is good enough, and that wonderful purity is terrible. It's like it's a horror in and of itself. It makes her terrifying and potent and powerful and so beyond the male characters in this book, so beyond them. I love that. I love that.
Yeah.
But there is a point where Immaculata, she summons a creature called the rake to go after the seer kind. And she talks, it's only of the vaguest throwaway reference, but the rake used to be one of her lovers, who apparently during his dabblings, and she says in these exact terms, summoned some otherworldly surgeons that filleted and flayed and skinned him.
That's right.
And I wonder who that could be. Does that sound familiar to any of the Clive Barker fans out there? Otherworldly surgeons that are summoned through ritual that happen to fillet and flay their victims? One wonders.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it's fun, isn't it? And he doesn't make it overt. It's not fan wanky or anything like that. It is a throwaway reference because Barker doesn't often do that. He actually doesn't. He doesn't often reference his own work.
Well, I mean, what's nice about that is it particularly fits with the notion of the rake themselves, because if that is the character, as the name heavily implies, a kind of seeker of, physical pleasure,
Absolutely,
a kind of, a hedonist.
He may as well have been called a libertine,
Yeah.
It's a nice thing, and I like the idea that these two universes exist together.
Yeah,
I do
definitely.
like that. I mean, there was, just going slightly off subject briefly, but there was talk at one time of Barker releasing a series of books or comics or maybe even films that melded the Hellraiser and Nightbreed mythologies together.
Right.
Where you would have the Cenobites, the children of Leviathan, being the enemies of the Nightbreed.
Right.
Which is really interesting. Baphomet, the god of the Nightbreed, being counterposed to Leviathan. That could have been wonderful. I could see how that would have worked, on a purely mythological level. That could have been fantastic, but it never came off, unfortunately.
I mean, it feels like there's space for it, doesn't it? That's the thing about. I think that's the thing about Barker's mythology across those three titles. Is it's the feeling that. It's the feeling that you can just kind of peel up the skin of the world, and there's
literally
a whole other world underneath.
Yeah, which literally happens, in those books. It literally happens when the Jaff actually manages to practice the art, when he manages to master it. He actually does that. Yeah. And it is a multiverse, that universe.
Yes.
When you read deeper into it, it is a multiverse. It's this, you have Quiddity, which is the Sea of Dreams, and every reality is an island in Quiddity.
But the thing that's different, I think, with Weaveworld in particular is it seems to me that what the Weave represents is the power of narrative itself, the power of stories themselves.
Oh, absolutely.
To gain life and sentience and magic. It feels very much like when we were talking earlier about the fact that Barker, the phrase I use is he respectfully rejects the Lewis kind of mythology. What I was particularly thinking of there was the way he roots the notion of the scourge in the myth of Eden.
Yeah.
But then very, very explicitly textually rejects that as being the truth of the matter.
Absolutely.
And I think that's he creates it as the myth. And he gives you 20 or 30 pages to go, oh, maybe it is.
Yeah.
And then he textually rejects it, says, of course, that's not what it was.
No, absolutely.
But the myth of Eden was created off the back of something that was real, that is something deeper and weirder. And
a much wider mythology.
Yeah.
That's actually very real. It's actually within the reality of the book is very, very true.
Yeah.
Physically true. And the notion.
And I think that's really clever, and he does that a few times, because obviously there's this thing about the Temple of Bone underneath the church as well later, right? Which is a wonderful sequence.
Oh, I love that sequence. Yeah, the Shrine of the Mortalities.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh,
that's right.
So cool! I love that. And you have that wonderful moment where Shadwell and the Scourge, much later in the book, return to the Shrine of the Mortalities after Immaculata and her sisters have been dispatched, essentially.
Yes.
Spoilers, by the way.
Yeah.
And you have this redemptive moment for Immaculata.
Very much so.
And for the sisters. Yeah. This is something I absolutely love in Barker's fiction. He does this a hell of a lot. You have this wonderful ambiguity where even the most terrible entities, like Immaculata, and bloody hell is she terrible.
Yes.
Oh, she's terrifying. At the beginning of the book, she's actually, I think he describes her as having lethality in her gaze. She can actually kill people by looking at them, or she can drive them mad by looking at them. There's a sequence when, very early on, when Susanna first meets Immaculata, and it's in her grandmother's house. And
Yep.
Immaculata fixes her with a gaze, and Susanna can feel it. She can actually feel this woman's gaze sweeping around her, and she can feel that if she wanted it, she could just flay the flesh from her bones by looking at her. It's amazing. The power of this woman is unbelievable. But, as terrible as she is, she has this wonderful arc within the story, whereby she, as pure and as genocidal and as ideologically zealous as she is, she learns better. This creature learns better, and she becomes a redemptive force by the end. And this is something that Barker does a hell of a lot. Creatures that are by their nature mythological, or that have some degree of some sort of mythology behind them, some sort of fantastical element, he has sympathy for, no matter how terrible they are, even if they're utter monsters. But creatures like, for example, Shadwell,
Oh, yes.
who is the real villain of this book, I would say, who don't have any dreams, who are representative of everything Barker regards as poisonous in humanity, and in very specifically, I will say, mankind, because it is mankind that he's having a go at in Shadwell. They have no redemption at all. The people who just want to own things, who just want to sell things, because that's all Shadwell is. He is the most... He is sort of like a vessel for everything Barker regards as hateful in humanity.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I don't want to get too political about this, because Barker doesn't strike me as a kind of big P politics writer, but the fact that he's a salesman.
Yeah.
I mean, let's just deal with that for a second.
And that's what he wants to do. At the beginning of the book, he wants to sell Wonderland, so he has the potential. I mean, he's got miracles at his fingertips with Immaculata around.
Yep.
But his first thought is that he wants to sell Wonderland. I mean, it's a subtle thing, because Barker never comments upon it as such. He never, takes you away and says, this man is bad because this is what he believes and this is what he feels. It's just you get a portrait of the man as this sweaty, grubby, small-minded, undreaming, uninspired narcissist. Who just wants ownership of things. He can't appreciate, and he's counterpointed by Calhoun and Susanna and the others who visit the Weaveworld, who do find some measure of miracle there, who do find it to be something that evokes everything that's wonderful in humanity, that inspires, that snares imagination, that metaphysically moves them. Shadwell's got none of that. He's got none of that. And he visits the Weaveworld. He sees it. He actually walks it a couple of times. But to him, all it is a place to own. All it is a place to conquer. And later, when he realises it's not a thing that can be owned, that it can't be controlled, to be destroyed.
But the interesting thing about the sales is, even when he wants to sell it, he wants to sell it not even for... I mean, that's what's so empty about him. It's not even for the wealth it will give him. It's for having achieved the fact of selling it. The act of selling itself
and that's
is...
it. It's perverse, isn't it?
It is.
It's a conscious act of desecration that he's performing here. Because there is that line, isn't there, where he says early on, money's not just doesn't interest him anymore, because with Immaculata around, he can just conjure it.
Well, this is it, and he's got the coat, hasn't he? Which is,
what a great device that is.
One of the, just
it's one of those
nightmarish
things.
invention.
Like, reading it as a writer, I'm like, oh, you bastard, Barker, you absolute wanker. I wish I'd come up with it.
Yeah. No, it's absolutely fantastic, and it's clever because it feels entirely classic, because what it gives you is your heart's desire, right? I mean, you see whatever it is you most want, and once you get whatever that is, you'll basically do whatever you're asked, because you have your heart's desire.
And again, he's selling. It's not like abstract either, is it? There will always be a physical item.
Yes.
There'll always be a physical item.
I mean, it's so heartbreaking what he does to Carl's dad in that regard.
It's awful. Is it Brendan? Yeah, it's horrible. It's absolutely horrible because Brendan, it's a very odd thing, Weaveworld, in this regard. Barker very often can be really vicious when it comes to, like, normality.
Yes.
He can be
Yes,
really horrible. I mean, if you read...
He can be quite standoffish, can't he?
Yeah, anything that he considers to be banal.
Yeah.
And just like people who want to lead what they consider normal lives, who live like domestic lives, who have like no particular inspirations or desire to create anything. He can be quite nasty about it sometimes. If you read books like Sacrament, he's very nasty about it sometimes. But in Weaveworld, he's got this quiet affection for them. Brendan is never painted in a negative light in this book.
No, that's an interesting point, and also the lovers that the two main characters both take. And I'm thinking
Geraldine
especially,
and the other guy, who I think his name is Todd, I believe.
Yeah.
Who only like turns up once or twice. They are never painted as negative characters. They're actually quite innocent.
Yeah, I mean, Geraldine's I found particularly interesting because he keeps describing her as having this kind of practical streak, which is very much a kind of... But it doesn't... It's an odd... Yeah, it is...
It could have
it's
been
distant, but it is quite affectionate. It could have been quite pointed. It could have been quite mean, actually.
Given Calhoun's relationship with Susanna, which is very complex, very complex indeed, and the fact that Geraldine learns about it, Calhoun does tell her about it at one point, and yet she is not this cipher for drama. She actually accepts it and goes on. She gets on with things. There's something very affectionate about that. Okay, she is not the woman that Susanna is, you know? She is not... I mean, Susanna effectively becomes the next Immaculata, doesn't she, by the end of the book? But in a very positive way, you know? There is still this affection for Geraldine. I could imagine her, after the events of the book, finding the Weaveworld and living there, you know? Quite comfortably.
Yeah, I think so, because I think she just has that ability to kind of accept what's going on in front of her and just kind of get on with it.
Yeah, it's a kind of a shrug, isn't it? You know, it's like, well, that's what there is, and I will just knuckle down and get on with it. There is a sweetness to it, and that it's an interesting thing thematically for the book, because the temptation, I imagine for Barker in particular, who has made this contrast a lot of times before, is to set up this almost hostile dichotomy between the real, between the banal, the domestic, and the miraculousness of the Weaveworld. But that actually doesn't happen, or rather it happens and then it's dissolved. Because what it happens is you learn that the seer kind are not these angelic divine creatures. They're as petty and as pathetic and as easily led as anybody else. I mean, there's that point in the book where Shadwell takes on the persona of the prophet. Yeah. And they are completely enthralled to him.
Yeah. And that's really heartbreaking, isn't it? When one of the characters that we've really come to kind of gain a lot of affection for suddenly turns up all starry-eyed, and he's like, "The prophet is here, the prophet." And you know, like you're in a Clive Barker story, so you know if there's a dude called the prophet, there's no question he's the good guy.
Oh, absolutely! Right? You know what's going to happen there, because I think at that point, as the reader, you don't know who he is.
No, you don't. No, they play out the Shadwell reveal takes another 40 or 50 pages of the prophet's here, but you know he's not a good guy. I mean, there aren't too many constants in Barker's works. It's one of the things that's impressive about him. But one of the things you can rely on is if a dude turns up claiming to have the answer in capital letters,
they're fucked.
Run.
They're monsters. They are going to do something awful.
And of course, the fact that it's Shadwell is wonderful, because you're back to the salesman.
Yeah,
and you're back to the notion of the sale as this kind of ultimate corruption of spirituality.
It's very interesting though, isn't it? Because Shadwell really finds his milieu there as the prophet, doesn't he? I mean, for him, all he's doing is exactly the same spiel. And again, you get this very quiet commentary and criticism from Barker. The fact that he's put Shadwell literally in a prophet's skin. He is essentially saying, like, they're salesmen. Whether they're selling you salvation or whether they're selling you baubles, it doesn't matter. It's the same basic stuff. It's the same basic spiel, and you will be harmed by it, you know?
And if you think about when he's writing, it pretty much, the era in which he's writing is the first birth of televangelism.
It's the likes of Billy Graham.
That's right.
Yeah, Peter Popov. And
it's just starting to seep into the British consciousness as something that even exists, right? Because obviously it took us a long time to get the God Channel, but we're starting to become aware
aware of it. It's very much it for me. It felt very very dead on kind of.
But
yeah,
without being overt, I mean, it's so clever because it's never shrill, is it? You know what I mean?
Oh,
he never,
God, no. God, no.
It's so clever that because it never belabours the story, it never deviates from the story. You never get the impression Barker's preaching at you, ironically.
No, not at all. And the other thing I was thinking about, kind of relating to that, which is interesting with Barker as a kind of very kind of, who's always been open about his sexuality.
Totally.
It's actually, I was thinking about, there are ways in which Weaveworld is actually, quite heteronormative.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the major relationships are male-female pairings, and they're kind of, but interestingly, it is actually both of the lead characters are effectively polyamorous.
Mm-hmm. They certainly
and again,
are.
He doesn't name it as that, and he certainly doesn't make a big deal out of it. They just
are. They just are.
They just are poly.
Absolutely. And although the actual relationships are heteronormative, and I would argue there's a very good reason for that, it's because he's playing with classic mythology and mythological archetypes and inverting them on almost every level. And that's exactly what happens throughout. The book itself and the story itself is powerfully that of a gay writer.
Right.
In the sense that unlike almost anyone else who's writing at the time, with the possible exception of maybe Neil Gaiman, he's investing everything with these counterculture perspectives. He is on the outside of the fishbowl looking in and commenting upon these meta-narratives that very often straight writers do comment upon, but from the inside. Because they apply to them. Whereas to someone like Barker, they wouldn't have. Certainly not at the time of writing. He would have been forced into that position of exile. So he's looking upon them and he is lampooning them. He's parodying them in an affectionate way. Not in a hypercritical way, but in a manner that exposes some of their hypocrisies. And you get a lot of that when you get to the character of Hobart. You've already had the... You've already had the attack upon industry and commercialism and whatnot in Shadwell. And now you've got law, which again, Barker again would have a very particular perspective on as a gay man.
Well, yeah, right. I mean, as a gay man, I've grown up in the shadow of Thatcher's Britain, right? And what was it?
Section 28.
Thank you, Section 28, and all that kind of associated, just, let's call it what it is, codified state-sponsored homophobia.
Absolutely.
I mean, very explicitly,
Absolutely. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because Hobart is another one of Barker's commentaries. He is, and again, not in any overt way. Whatever commentary exists is in the character. Yeah. It's in the
absolutely.
character.
Yeah, no, completely. And what I like about Hobart is really, he's a brilliantly drawn villain because he is completely and utterly unaware of his own villainy.
Oh, totally. He's the hero.
Yeah, he's the hero of his own story, and he's completely invested in his vision of how the world should work. And, because I think it's very easy to play, it's easier to play a character like that as knowing they're corrupt and reveling in the violence and enjoying the grubbiness of it. Hobart's not that. He's a purist.
He's a total purist. And
it's the very purity that drives him to such extremes of behaviour, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, he's like he's the Inquisition all over again, right? And to put that in a modern police officer.
It's terrifying, isn't it? But again, it's something Barker would have seen to some degree or another.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's something he would have perceived and would have suffered under. And that is fantastic, isn't it? In this very abstract story, you get these incredible experiential accounts, and yet are not entirely semi-autobiographical. It's very clever.
It is clever. I think what I enjoy about those as well, and this is more a kind of this is about a personal relationship to art rather than maybe on its own merits or whatever, but. One of the things that appeals to me about both of those characters is that, for me, I feel that there is a real... I sense Barker's rage, underneath the surface. And he doesn't short sell either of those characters. They are well-rounded. They have, interiority. They have, thoughts and beliefs and hopes and dreams and all that stuff. And they're very well drawn. He doesn't sell them, sure. But there's just this anger within Barker, as I feel coming through as he's writing.
Manifests. It does manifest because they both get their comeuppance in different ways. You have this. One of the wonderful subtexts of the story, which I absolutely adore, is the relationship between Hobart and Susanna. And simultaneously, the relationship between the dragon and the maiden.
Yeah, that's so good.
I love it. The way that Hobart initially sees himself as the dragon.
Yeah.
But isn't. At his core, he can't. He's not. He can't maintain it. But she is.
Absolutely.
She's not the maiden archetype, which she would be in any other story.
Yep.
In even very likely from Barker's contemporaries, Yeah,
that's
she
right.
would have been a victim character, and she's so not. And what I love about it is, as much anger as there is in Barker at what Hobart represents, there is this sympathy for Hobart as well.
Yeah.
He's hurt. The guy is a wounded guy, and you see it in that wonderful moment of understanding that him and Susanna have when they encounter one another in the fairy tale wood, and they swap roles. He starts off as the dragon.
So great. Yeah.
She starts off as the maiden. Then she becomes the dragon, and he becomes the wounded knight who just wants. He's had enough.
Yeah.
He's had enough. He can't sustain in this world, and she sees him for what he is. He sees her for what she truly is, and they have that moment of intimacy, and then it's gone.
Yeah.
Then it's gone.
But it's also interesting with what you said there, just made me think in terms of the inversion. So obviously there you've got a very classic inversion, the captured maiden and the dragon ascendant, and how that is literally inverted in the story.
Absolutely.
But you also made me think about, you said that in any other story Susanna would be the maiden. Of course, Susanna is explicitly not a maiden. She has sex.
Exactly.
She has joyful sex with various partners as part of this story. But the maiden is the terrifying one.
The terrifying one. The virgin is actually the terrifying entity, and the slayer of men,
Yeah, she's got all the power, and not just men, I mean, she's just this incredibly destructive force. So there's almost a commentary against virginity.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's explicit in the book. I think that's absolutely explicit. Okay, you do get this notion that Immaculata's purity and her virginity give her powers that lovers cannot utilize.
Yeah.
But it's terrible. It's this moribund power. It's this power of destruction. Like, even there's the wonderful it's one of my favorite sequences in the book. It's after it's when the carpet first erupts, and the characters are drawn into it, and Immaculata is she is clawed by this group of lions for reasons that are far too complex to go into. Her beauty is defiled, basically. And she's sent mad briefly and cast into like this pit of mad people, and Susanna reminds her of who she is. Mistakenly, it's a mistake, and she rises from it, and her shadow is killing people. Whoever falls under her shadow is having a heart attack and dying as she's levitating. As I think Barker describes her as this wounded Madonna.
Yes,
and the image is just amazing. The image is amazing. Yeah, and it's so complex to talk about. Every single sequence, every single image carries with it this power. You have these inversions of fairy tale and religious and mythological archetypes. Barker either lampooning them or undoing them, or showing facets of them that are entirely parts of what they are, but which people don't tend to realise.
I mean, that's the stuff that I think, for my money, that's the bits that really crackle the most, is where he embraces it and then moves beyond it and takes you as the reader beyond it and says, now look behind the curtain.
Well, look at the scourge. Look at the scourge. But, Hobart gets to be the dragon.
He does.
He gets exactly what he wants, and it's not what he wants.
Well, but that's also Shadwell's story again and again and again. Shadwell's story is getting what he wants, and it's not what he wants. And that's about bottomless obsession, right?
Totally.
That's about that,
and also
kind of
limited imagination. Like, there's that wonderful point where he actually he changes his ambition at one point. He wants to become a god. He wants to get to the arcane heart of the weave, where the raw power of creation is just bound. It's what sustains the Weaveworld. And he accesses the temple where he believes this thing, the loom, they call it,
Yeah.
is. And of course, in his myopia, in his materialism, he thinks it's a loom. He thinks it's a machine. He thinks it's something that he can pick up and that he can manipulate. And he finds the temple empty.
Yeah,
He finds the temple empty. And Immaculata mocks him, obviously, because she's already there. She mocks his literalism. She mocks his literalism. And that's the whole hilarity. That's the parody of Shadwell. You know, he'll never get what he wants.
Yeah.
He'll never get what he wants because he's just
Shadwell and
materialism.
Hobart. It's Shadwell and Hobart. They both have that literalism that they are undone by, right? I mean, that's and again, that's Barker. You know, that's Barker's fury.
Yeah, totally.
The kind of.
But you know what? He's got more sympathy for Hobart than he does for Shadwell.
That's true.
Hobart has moments. Hobart, like when the scourge possesses him and he realizes what it is, he tries to stop it.
Yeah.
To the point whereby he loses his hands. You know, he tries to stem the flow, and the scourge obliterates his hands for it.
Yeah.
And it goes. Barker takes some gruesome relish, it has to be said, but also elicits sympathy in describing what the scourge does to him when it's inside of him. It cooks him. You know, he can't sustain this thing, whatever the hell it happens to be. This creature of fire and of elemental destruction. He can't contain it, and it's eating him from the inside out. And it's kind of sad. You actually do develop a degree of sympathy for Hobart. Even Susanna does. And, you know, there's a sequence of the book where he's her bane, you know?
Yes.
He's harassing her across the entirety of the earth, and he can't let her go. It's a kind of twisted love that he has, you know?
Yeah.
It's amazing.
But it also reminds me of, I mean, the thing we're talking about with both of those characters, I'm reminded again of desperation, and I'm reminded of the point at which God via Johnny is talking to the kid, is talking to David, and, you know, why should I have to go back and fight evil? You know, are you saying if we don't fight Tack, he'll take over the world? And God's saying, no, evil's always self-destructive.
Yeah. Oh, totally. Totally.
You know,
and
it can't sustain itself.
All forms of evil in this book are self-destructive. They're consumptive. Some of them know it. Like Immaculata at the beginning of the book, she has no ambitions beyond the genocide of the seer kind.
Yeah.
I imagine she would just let herself unravel after that.
Absolutely, yeah.
Shadwell, on the other hand, just can't perceive beyond. He's too limited in terms of his imagination. He literally cannot perceive beyond attaining his goals. Which again is another reason why he'll be perpetually unsatisfied and perpetually unhappy. And it's why he has such great arcs. I mean, he goes through 3 basic states in the book. He begins as the salesman.
Yeah.
He has a brief period as a messiah and wants to be a god. And then he becomes a fundamentalist crusader.
Yeah.
And they're all born out of the fact that he is fundamentally empty and dissatisfied, that what he can't control, what he can't own, he has to destroy. And of course, he can't own dreams. He can't own inspiration, which is what the seer kind are. It's what they deal in. It's their bread and butter. It is literally what they live and breathe from day to day. He'll never be able to control them, so he has to destroy it. And magic in general, he becomes this fundamentalist jihadist against magic.
Yes. Yeah, it's so great.
It is. It's wonderful. And it's believable as well. I mean, that would be very difficult to write, I imagine. And in the hands of a lesser writer, those transitions would be very, 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 very difficult and probably wouldn't work.
I mean, I wonder about that too. I realise, unlike King, who I've spent a certain amount of time kind of following and reading about, I don't know anything about Barker's process. I don't know if he's a pantser or a plotter.
From what I understand, it's very eclectic. It's very eclectic. He writes everything short, longhand, on paper.
Oh wow! Okay.
And there are often his study when he's done. There are piles, just piles and piles and piles of redundant drafts, of deviations, of bits that go this way, bits that go that way, and then the big process is paring all that down to the story.
I cannot imagine writing something like this by hand. I
know, right? I know, right?
It makes me cry to think about it.
Can you imagine in Magica?
Oh,
I dread to think what the manuscripts for that looked like.
yeah.
Because
Yeah.
that's the magnum opus. That's the one that people regard as his
Yeah.
as the culmination of his work. And Barker himself has actually said, "I'll never write anything like that again."
Yeah.
Because it encapsulates everything, it encapsulates everything. For my money, I love Imagica. I think it is such a stunningly ambitious book, but I
Yeah.
love the elegance of Weaveworld better.
Yeah. It's an interesting. I'd have to revisit it. I can't remember. I know I got them jumbled up because I reread The Great and Secret Show because in the run up to the release of the Scarlet Gospels, I reread all the Harry de Moore stuff,
and then realised that you didn't have to.
Yeah, but I'm glad I did because I hadn't read the second book of the art anyway.
Yeah. Oh,
So
Everville's
yeah, I'd
great.
never read that. Yeah, it is good. It is good. It's,
I prefer Everville to The Great and Secret Show actually now.
It's interesting. I think I found Everville. I found the early doors a bit of a slog. I found the first. It was a bit. I found it a bit slow to get going. But my God, when that caught,
bloody hell!
Jesus,
the imagery, Jesus,
yes,
God,
when
that tear on top of the mountain opens,
yeah,
and the art and quiddity starts to spill through.
Yeah.
Mental.
But I think also just the sense of creeping apocalypse and that. I mean, that's the imagery that I keep coming back to with that. But that's what it left me with.
There's a millennial quality to
definitely
the books of the art, definitely,
definitely,
more so than there is for Weaveworld, I would say.
Yeah, I'd agree.
Weaveworld
feels very 80s to me. I can't. I'm not quite sure, and I don't mean that. I mean unusually for me. I mean that as a compliment because normally that's I'm not a fan of 80s.
It's very not. Yeah.
But in the best possible way of its time, in that it feels like I mean, as I said before, Thatcherism feels very much like it's in the mix. The evangelical stuff, the birth of televangelism feels like it's very much part of what's going on.
Oh, absolutely. The deprivation of the 1980s. He doesn't make a thing of it. He doesn't make a thing of it, but it is there.
Yeah, and it is in that sense. It's class conscious, and I appreciate that.
I also love, it's something I absolutely love about the book. The fact that Calhoun and Susanna, they're not like they are not especial.
No, that's right.
They are not doing great or grand things. They're just very, very, very plain, normal people. And I mean, Calhoun's from a very working class background, isn't he? I mean, his dad keeps pigeons.
Pigeons. I love that opening. I mean, that was the other thing. So with the Imagica, I'd gotten the beginnings confused. I remembered the guy working in the dead letter office.
Oh, from the Great and Secret Show.
Right, and I jumbled that. Yes, which I jumbled in with Imagica, and I still think that's probably the best single opening to a story I've ever heard in my life.
Very good, isn't it?
It's
very good.
What a hook!
Yeah.
What an absolute! It's the kind of thing you read, and my immediate visceral reaction is seething jealousy.
Yeah. It's a conspiracy theorist wet dream, isn't it? The
it's
notion
just
that there is a secret language and communication occurring across the face of the world, but principally the USA.
Yeah.
And it's happening in these obscure, strange, redundant letters and parcels that are passing back and forth. It's so bloody clever. It's one of those things where you're like, how?
Yeah.
Where did it come from, Clive?
Exactly.
Because
as soon as you hear it, you think, fuck yes, a dead letter office. That is such a creepy, brilliant idea.
Yeah. It is,
so
isn't it? Because you have
brilliant.
this wonderful nexus of dead communication there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it is wonderful. It is inherently creepy. It's a place where there are very real ghosts writing to one another,
Right, exactly, yeah.
It's brilliant.
Yeah.
It's so clever. And again, you get... Barker's very good at that, though. He is good.
Yeah.
I tell you one thing, he is very good at openings and endings.
Well, that's what I was going to go to, because what I had, and therefore I completely blanked the opening of Weaveworld. I had not retained it, and it was such a joy because it's such a simple but completely compelling hook.
Yeah, it's
brilliant.
So easy, isn't it? It's so easy and flowing, but I guarantee you he agonised over it.
Yeah, I'm sure.
I guarantee you he did.
But it sings on the page, and it just again, what's nice is it does evoke that the fantasy magic of old. I mean, it for me very much evokes Narnia. It's that feeling of the real world colliding with something different.
But even the mechanism of the pigeon is itself a very Narnian way of getting to Wonderland, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Like all of the Narnia books, they have a different way of getting to Narnia in every book, and they often have something like this where the characters are drawn off of a beaten track by something.
Yes. Yeah.
Whether it's the bullies that are chasing Jill and Eustace in the silver chair, whether it's the painting in the Dawn Treader, whether it's the wardrobe in the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. There's always something like that. And if you didn't know any better, you could imagine that it is going to be a very Narnian book indeed, which it is in many, many subtle and varied ways. I know for a fact that Lewis and Narnia were a big influence on this book. I also know for a fact that Barker very intentionally and affectionately criticizes and lampoons those stories through this work.
It's done. I mean, it's done with such love and respect.
Oh, totally.
That's what I think
it's
is
not
so
like
great.
It's not like Pullman-esque.
No. Right. Exactly. No, he's not sticking his finger in anybody's eye. No. But he's just like, let's fix some of this.
What he's doing, he's taking the basic dynamic of metaphysical fantasy. And he's saying, let's release it from tradition. Let's unshackle it.
Yeah, and a non-trivial part of that, and the trouble is when you say it, it sounds trivial, but it's not. A non-trivial part of that is him saying, "Hey, it's okay to have sex."
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, have you ever seen his quotes about this? He actually said one of his principal motivations for this was, I wanted to bring sex to Wonderland.
Right, and
which he totally does, but not just...
Mission accomplished.
Totally, yeah, but not just in a titillating way. Although the erotic scenes are brilliantly written, he's very good at erotica, I've got to say. He is bloody good. It's not the be-all and end-all. That is woven into the themes and the mythology of this book. What he does is he takes the classic archetypes of fantasy, mythology, and he reveals that sex are part and parcel of them anyway.
Yeah, and always were. Right?
Absolutely. You can't have the triune goddesses without talking about sex.
Right.
It's not possible.
But just the way he goes there, I mean, I'm glad you brought that up because it is something I want to get back to. I mean, one of the really kind of hideous tropes that's
I know exactly
haunted,
where you're going.
Haunted especially grimdark fantasy is that of rape, and of course we had the fairly recent hoo-ha and with A Song of Ice and Fire and the televised series, and there was some understandably very strong reactions to what happened there. What's interesting in this is the way Barker completely inverts that as well. Completely.
So yes, there is actually rape in this story, but it's not men raping women.
Nope.
There's that character, that sequence. I remember reading that for the first time when I was a kid. The sequence where outside of the engagement party.
Yeah, that's the one.
The Magdalene, the mother, Mama Puss, descends for the first time.
Mama Puss.
That sequence is horrific.
Yeah. No, it is.
But it's a very deliberate inversion. It's a very deliberate inversion of the fantasy archetype because traditionally, of course, it's the male forcing themselves up on the female.
Yeah.
That's not the case here.
But it's following through the logic. If you invert the maiden and you make the maiden a source of horror, and you make the maiden a source of in that incarnation of the maiden, that incarnation of the triumph, then you have to do the same with the mother. How do you do that? I mean, you can see how he got there. Once it happens, once you start picking at it, it's very consistent. It makes perfect sense.
Totally, it does. And these are what I love about the lampoons of these archetypes is that he's not moved them terribly far away from what they actually are, or from what they imply in their traditional forms. It's just that people choose to ignore it.
Well, yeah, there you go, exactly. And of course, her children are...
the byblows, bloody hell.
Because they're actually a pivotal part of the story.
Yeah.
Those children, they keep coming back at you.
They do, I mean, and in different ways as well. I mean, when Shadwell weaponizes them against Immaculata. I
mean, that might be the darkest single moment in the book.
Yeah,
right?
it's the way he weaponizes them, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because it's not violence, not in the traditional way.
No.
It's a different kind of violence. It's sexual violence and desecration.
It's a profound violation, specifically that he knows will harm her as much as it possibly can. And it's the fact that it's also at the same time it's his moment of betrayal, right? It's the moment when he finally, and that's really tough. I found that was one of the toughest sequences to read, when he's like cajoling her to give him the names of the children, because he's like, I'm going to need to know this because we're going to be doing the thing. And it's just like, how does she not realize the salesman has sold her? He's
made a prostitute of her, ironically. He's actually prostituted her. He's done it actually ties back to something he's ruminating upon when we first find him, in that hotel room.
How would I sell her?
How would I sell her?
Yeah.
And he's done it. He's managed to do it, and he's belittled her. Again, it's demonstrating the profound, corrupting evil of Shadwell.
And the interesting thing is, the reason that she's blind to it in that moment is because she herself is about to attain the goal that she has so long hungered for. She is so blinded by her own hunger and lust and greed for the moment that she takes her eye off the ball.
Yeah,
because she would never normally be fooled by this guy.
God, no.
Not for a second. But in that moment, because she is about to obtain the previously unobtainable, because she's actually, funnily enough, she's in a similar position that Shadwell finds himself in throughout the book. He's always, that's his story, is attaining the unobtainable, and then it not being anything he wanted, and a furious reaction against that leads him to go up against the next unattainable. She's in that moment there. She sees her dream becoming realized, and she just...
It's the one moment of vulnerability in the entire book, isn't it? It's the one moment, and he sees it. And that's it. That's the end.
And to be fair to her, she has absolutely no reason to suppose that his mind has changed from the part. I mean, why would she suspect that he's actually suddenly decided he wants the whole thing?
Of course.
Nothing about him to that. But nothing about him to that point has indicated that's something he would do.
No.
She knows him as the salesman. She doesn't realize what's going on underneath the surface. What's been shifting for him the whole time.
I suppose in a way,
it's so good.
It's a mistake. It's a mistake of her nature in many respects. Because she is so pure and so certain. She kind of expects other people to be sure and certain and pure as well. And to her, that's his place. He's the salesman. He's kind of, and also he's less than her fundamentally. What could he possibly do? What could he possibly do to harm her? And of course, you have to also bear in mind she's reeling at that point from the loss of her sisters.
Yeah, that's true.
Her sisters have been destroyed at that point. I don't know if both of them been destroyed or just the Magdalene.
I can't remember.
I think it's just the Magdalene, because Susanna's really, she's learning how to use the menstruum at this point, and she's really let it go,
Yeah.
That's another thing I love, actually, the way that Susanna is becoming like them.
Yeah.
She's becoming more and more one of the sisters with every step, and the way Immaculata has respect for her.
Yeah.
Because of that. It's wonderful. There is this sort of slightly fraternal thing going on between them, a sisterly thing going on between them. And I almost would love more of that. I would almost love to see more of that,
Yeah, it's a fascinating relationship, isn't it? And complex. It is, as you say, it is complex.
Bloody complex.
And it does feel built on respect, which is really, that certainly elevates it. I mean, one of the things I like about the arc of that character is the fact that she does get that redemption scene finally. She gets that redemption at the very end in the chapel.
In the Shrine of Mortalities, yeah.
Yeah, but what I love about that is she gets it without ever compromising the core of who she is.
Oh yeah, it's never like, she doesn't ever have a seeing the light moment or anything
it's not a come to Jesus moment at all.
No, she's still essentially what she is, and could probably still be pretty terrible,
Yeah.
But she has just ascended. She's moved beyond the concerns that she once had. She's become something other. She's become something else. And it's this wonderful serenity that she has that she never has before. She's driven and frantic and powerful early in the book. And then when she's been reduced to her essence, she is literally a ghost. She gets this wonderful serenity.
Yeah,
about
but
her.
I feel like it's a commentary on the nature of that kind of particularly child fantasy. But the thing about, like, one of the absolutely essential elements is the villain.
Mm-hmm.
There is no story without the
Oh,
villain.
absolutely.
And the meaner and more powerful and more terrifying the villain is, the better the story.
Yeah.
I mean, this is just QED.
Yeah, totally.
This is an equation, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for me, part of what's going on with there is Barker's commentary, and that it almost feels like she's understanding the role of her nature within the story, and
Yeah.
she's getting, like, the point of being the evil one is not to win.
Mm-hmm.
The point is to present the threat that elevates the heroes to
Yeah.
become the thing that they need to be, and that's the realization that she's reached when
Yeah.
she's in that space.
She's almost
so her nature
surrendering
hasn't,
in a
yeah, her
way.
nature hasn't really changed, but she's embracing, she's understanding that
Yeah.
it was in the service of something bigger,
Something greater,
right?
which of course
Yeah.
we do get glimpses of throughout the book, because there is a suggestion in the book that these events are inevitable and
Yeah.
have played out before and are going to play out again. There's
Yeah.
that wonderful time dilation thing that happens when Cal gets close to the hinterlands of the Weave, when he's close to the fugue, and he meets that guy. He meets
Yeah.
that man who we learn at the end of the book is him. It
Yeah.
never explicitly states it, but it's him. It's him
Yeah.
after he's come to live in the Weave.
Yeah, that's right.
But living in the Weave before that's ever happened.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. It's this whole notion that stories never end. They never have a beginning. They never have an ending. They are these wonderful paradoxes that interweave with one another. That's what you get at the end. And the whole conceit of the Weaveworld unraveling and then being contained within a book. I mean,
Yeah.
it becomes very literal at that point, you know, what we're talking about here. It's about saving human imagination. It's everything that Barker
Absolutely.
really champions in his books, you
Yeah.
know, which is the primacy of imagination and of storytelling and of inspiration. It's the abstractions of humanity are what will save us in Barker's worlds.
And that's why the ending is so unapologetically triumphant.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why the ending is, and so and so uplifting. I mean,
It
I'd
is.
forgotten that it was such an unambiguously happy ending, but it is.
It totally is. I mean, there's been loss along the way. There's a body count a classically
there is.
Barkerian body count in this
Yep,
book,
yep,
certainly. But there is a celebratory ending and it fits. It works.
Does
you know,
work.
it's not like, say, the ending to Return of the Jedi or something like that. You know,
No.
which is really actually not very good at all. It fits and it works, and it's actually kind of rare for this kind of fiction. There is a tendency for this kind of story to fall flat at the end or to
Yeah.
fail in some fundamental way. But I've read the book any number of times now, and the ending always gets me in the same way. It
it's so good.
always gets me in the same way. Everything is tied up. Everybody has their correct arc and their correct ending.
And I love the coda too. I mean, I love the whole sequence where Cal is lost to himself and lost to the world, and it's just so. And the way he does this a few times in the book. Actually, it's something I noticed. He's really not afraid to just let moments play out.
No.
And Cal in particular, actually, because there's the whole moment after the first big, experience in the Weave.
Yeah.
Where Cal just forgets everything.
That for me. I hate that. It hurts so much, that part of the book.
And
It
we're with him
hurts.
for like a long time. We're with him for like
Yeah.
20 or 30 pages of him just mooching through
Oh,
his life.
God, willing him to remember.
Oh, it's so good.
Willing him
So
to
good.
remember, because he's just like, God, you've had Wonderland.
Yeah.
You've had like confirmation of what most human beings want. Basically, if they're honest with themselves, you know, for dreams to be real.
Yeah.
And it's your basic humanity and the world around you has conspired to make you lose it.
Yeah. No, it's so great. And, the thing about, the feeling that the story's somehow preordained is interesting too, because one of the other things that I did notice was that the novel's kind of, well, I mean, an unkind way to view the novel would be it's a protracted exercise in keeping Cal and Susanna from ever being in the same fucking room.
Kind of, yeah.
Because, like, it's brutal how life just continually conspires to just fucking keep these two people away.
But they do have that reconciliation.
Oh, they do, and it's brilliant.
Like, it is the best thing. Because he actually does that very clever thing. It's a very classic thing of putting privation in between it.
Yeah.
So they both suffer enormously in between.
Yeah.
You know, from loss. I mean, Susanna's lover is beyond murdered. You know, taken by the Magdalene, raped and just reduced to nothing. Cal has his forgetfulness. He loses the seer kind. He has that trudge through the ice and snow.
And there's the loss of his father, which is just this very quiet, dignified moment in the middle of this grand, fantastical journey. A very, and I don't mean this is a derogatory term at all, but a very ordinary tale and portrait of grief.
It's just it's that one blip of normality, isn't it? It's a part of a normal life.
Yeah.
And it's awful, you know. It is quietly awful because he just finds him dead, doesn't he?
Yeah, yeah. And it's just so powerful. It's really, you know, and it's back to what I was talking about. The thing, it is unapologetically mundane, and yet that doesn't rob it of any of its emotional power at all. It's still extraordinarily poignant.
He's very clever at doing that, actually, throughout the book, of contrasting the moments within the weave, the moments where you're seeing these incredibly miraculous landscapes and architecture and miracles that are happening all over the damn place, with these moments of life, of gritty, concrete, plastic existence, which themselves have their own kind of poetry and grandeur that are counterposed, but also they sort of poetically emphasize the other bits. It's very clever. Very clever.
It does feel like it's about storytelling. I mean, that was very clearly what I got this time. Because, you know, what that powerfully reminds me of is that feeling when you sat at the keyboard for 2 hours and you've got very little memory of anything beyond what you've been imagining, right? And the words you've put down to try and describe what you've been imagining. And then you got to go take a piss.
Yeah. Oh, totally. You
have to get up and you have to go, and then the dog needs letting out, and then, you know, and it's just like... Your mind has been entirely absent in this, you know, whatever fun house or ghost house of your own making.
Absolutely.
Right?
And
running around trying your best to scare the shit out of yourself and get it on paper, and then suddenly you're like, oh right, blink blink, I need a cup of coffee.
Yeah, and it's the way like the book acknowledges that you need those moments. Those moments are entirely necessary in order for the miraculous to have any meaning.
Well, and I think I think you've hit on what it was that I was trying to get to with that. It's exactly that. It's that he has affection for that too. Mm-hmm. Whilst he clearly loves the Weaveworld and he clearly is in love with this land of imagination, he actually has a huge amount of affection for Liverpool, and he has a huge amount of affection for that way of life. And
I think the fact that he set it in his hometown is very significant indeed. Yeah. It's very significant because where else? What better place what better setting to play out these concerns and these issues, because they would be so poignant there for him.
And it does make it feel personal in a way that, you know, for all that I, you know, adore The Great and Secret Show, it's a different animal, isn't it?
Oh, it's totally different animal. I mean, what he's doing in The Great and Secret Show. Ironically, it's actually a kind of similar experiment, but it's not for say like a childhood home, it's for an adopted home.
Yeah.
It's because Barker wrote that after he moved to the US. Right. And he's writing that as a kind of mythological examination from an outsider's perspective of what the US is, of its unseen life, its abstract life as he perceives it. It's such a brilliant ambition in that regard, because there are not many writers, certainly not like popular writers or even cult writers of that era, who are writing in that way with such highfalutin ideas.
No, right, absolutely.
And
Yeah.
it's something that continually baffles me about Barker. I don't know. I do not know how the guy got a popular audience, got like a mainstream audience, because
Yeah.
he is so phenomenally clever. His work is so deep. It's like on the level of like J.G. Ballard, or like one of the really, the really intense science fiction
Like
writers.
Burroughs or
Yeah, Burroughs or whatever, that are dealing with the biggest, most profound, complex ideas imaginable. And yet somehow he's managed to smuggle those ideas under the radar, and package them in this way that's palatable to
Well,
a popular audience. It's so clever.
I mean, yes, he does. Absolutely, he does have all those things. I mean, but it's just so fucking readable.
Yeah.
That's the thing. I mean, I'm back to where I started on a sentence level. This fucking book.
Oh,
man.
I know, right? You read it. I mean, you read it as a writer, and it hurts, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It actually
And it
bloody
just
hurts, because you're like, I don't know how to be this good.
I mean, and the thing was, like, this time I paced myself very, very deliberately, and I put it down, and I would put it down and let it percolate for a few days before I picked it back up again. But it was an effort to put it down, because this fucking thing each sentence leads you to the next. It just takes you by the hand and just says, let's go.
I remember once, it was about a decade ago now, I was going out with a gentleman who lived in Ireland. So I was living here at the time. So early in the relationship, I was tazzing back and forth between here and Ireland, short flights. And I remember I took him a copy of Weaveworld once, because of course, for him to understand me, he'd have to read
Weaveworld. Weaveworld.
Absolutely.
Fair enough.
And I remember sitting, my airplane was delayed because we had like bad snow one year. And I sat and read half of Weaveworld whilst I was waiting for the plane. Fully half of it. And it didn't feel like a thing. It didn't feel like anything.
Yeah, no. It's so impressive. And yet again, that's true, but also it's a fucking epic story.
Oh God, yeah. I mean,
so much happens in this book, and so much time passes. That was the other thing that really impressed me this time. The amount of time that passes
it's a span of
through
years,
the length of the novel. Yeah,
it's a span
absolutely.
of years that passes within this book.
Yeah. And the passings of the seasons are significant. And actually, that's one of the thematic things. Cal, funnily enough, Cal always gets forgetful around winter.
Yeah, it's unusual, isn't
interesting.
It? Yeah. And also geographically as well. I mean, it's all over the place, isn't it? You get the sequences in Liverpool, you get the sequences across the country as Cal and Susanna in particular, as she's travelling across the country. The sequences in the Weaveworld, and again, you get a really good view of the geography and the topography of that place.
Sure.
And then you've got that sequence in the Rab al-Khali in the desert, which is bloody brilliant.
Oh yeah, and that comes quite late on. That's around sort of like the 3/4 mark.
Oh yeah, that's the end
or
game.
Something like that.
It's where,
but it's
where
really,
down.
it's a lengthy digression. There's that whole scene because you have Shadwell, like they're in the desert. He's on the edge of the desert, and he gets the stomach bug. Right, he gets the stomach flu.
I love it. I love that detail.
Great. Yeah,
I love that detail. The guy who's going to murder all magic in the world.
Yeah.
The guy who's going to like murder angels, basically.
If he could just get off this bucket that he's
so
currently glued to.
Such a brilliant detail, and you find that kind of thing again throughout Barker's fiction.
And yet again, you see, it's a mundane detail, it's a humanizing detail, but also the symbolism of it is actually quite powerful. He's purging him. He's literally purging.
He's actually
before
having a
going on the
experience.
final part of the quest.
Yeah, he's actually having like a guru or a pilgrim's experience. Like it's a shamanistic voyage for him.
Yeah,
very
absolutely.
much so. Okay, it's a dark shamanism, but very much so. And that's how he describes the Rab al-Khali, isn't it? It's like it's an emptiness that fills your soul, that steals everything from you. It's a real place, the Rab al-Khali.
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
okay.
I didn't know it until quite recently, but I saw it. I like accounts of explorers. I actually really love them. Who, particularly Victorian explorers who like went into like rainforests and deserts and whatnot. And I was reading this account by a guy who specialised in deserts, and he talks about the Rab al-Khali, and he talks about it in pretty much the same terms that Barker does. He says it is the emptiest, most desolate spot on the planet.
Wow.
And it infects you.
Yeah.
It claims a lot of people as well. A lot of people
Right.
go to try and cross it and they don't make it.
Well, I mean, there's that. There is that, to me, completely incomprehensible like strain within the nature of some humans
Oh,
that
yeah.
just can't keep it.
Can't
So
keep
like,
away. Oh yeah. I've got to swim the unfathomable. I've got
You
to
know what I
climb the
mean?
unclimbable.
Well, it's that great. It's that great Facebook meme that just says, "Remember that there's dozens of frozen bodies that will never be removed from Everest that were once very highly motivated people."
Totally true.
It's like,
Totally
yeah,
true. Yeah, there is something to be said there. Definitely.
it's like I'm quite happy sat here with my cocoa. I've got to be honest.
Yeah,
I don't
yeah,
really feel the
absolutely.
need.
Although I do understand the inclination, there is a part of me that likes that. I like mountain climbing. That is something I
That's
like to do. And I think it's that same inclination. Like I've got a real thing about desolations.
Okay,
I love
yeah.
desolations, and I like walking in them, and I'll walk for miles. I will walk forever across desolations. Places like Lindisfarne, like the island of Lindisfarne, for example, where there's nothing for miles and miles and miles and miles. I do love that. So I do understand the appeal of places like the Rub al Khali. I've crossed the Sahara. I've crossed the Sahara before. With guides, obviously.
I would have thought, yeah.
Yeah, not on my own. Bloody hell,
I didn't
no.
think you hitchhiked.
No, that was as close as I've come to it. But I do recall I did it when I was 21, and I remember crossing it and thinking, just going back to the book. I remember going back to Weaveworld, and I'm like, God, this is it. I'm actually doing what I read about, and I understand it now.
Yeah,
I understand.
That's really funny because that mirrors for me the experience of driving Highway 50 in Nevada and just being like, "Oh right, now I get desperation.
Yeah,
now I can because you get pulled over by a cop out here, you are fucked."
If you've read that book, you'd be absolutely bloody terrified, wouldn't you?
It wasn't good. I got to tell you, it wasn't good.
But yeah, he's very good at very sort of casually moving from one landscape to another and not making a muchness of it.
The transitions are very smooth. He takes you with him the whole way. The other thing that I was just so impressed by was it always feels real. I mean, that's no matter how fantastical it gets, and it gets pretty out there.
Pretty damn fantastical. But yeah, it does. It feels like these people are actually observing what they claim to be observing, and it's just another state of being. It is just another part of reality that they just had no context for before.
Yeah. And I love that whole thing of like this, the moment where it's when the Prophet's waging war and Hobart's men are all given shore leave, and it's all going in a kind of depressingly ugly, familiar way. But then you find out the next day what's actually become of his men.
It's so brilliant, and I love the fact that that's the way the Seer kind do wage war.
Oh yeah,
I love that.
That's right.
It's not with knives. It's not with bombs. It's not with assassinations.
No.
It's with seductions.
Yeah, I don't want to. I don't want to go too deep into Barker's own sort of biography, but fairly recent revelations about what he had to do to make ends meet.
Oh, absolutely,
as a young artist,
Totally, yeah. There's something there, isn't there? I mean, he does.
There is something there.
He does invest that in his fiction, and certainly early on. I mean, there's the story "Human Remains" in the Books of Blood, where the protagonist is very much an autobiography of Barker at that time of his life.
Right.
It's there.
But I felt that sequence was very much. And again, if we think about I don't know if he had any run-ins with the law at that point in his life, but he obviously. I can't imagine how vulnerable you might feel as a young male prostitute working in that kind of environment. The vulnerability you'd feel towards the police, and the fear you'd feel of the police, their ability to harm you materially, right?
My God, and as like a gay man doing that,
yeah, exactly.
It's even worse, at that time, you wouldn't be afraid of being arrested. You'd be afraid of being beaten to death.
Well, this is it, exactly, yeah. You'd be afraid of what they would do to you either before or after they slap the cuffs on you. That would be where the fear would come from.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, of course, you've got the extra fears surrounding that, I mean, will I walk away from the next mark, or will they harm me in some fundamental way? And I love the fact that he does this, that he takes these experiences and invests them in something. I mean, he's experienced some ugly stuff.
Yeah.
This guy.
Yeah.
He's experienced some real ugliness, some real human ugliness. And that ugliness is in this story.
Yeah.
There is human ugliness here, but it's counterpointed. It's always contrasted and counterpointed by the best in humanity.
Yeah.
The very best. And he never makes that mawkish.
No,
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
He never, like Susanna's the best example I can think of. She's not an innocent.
No. And actually, Susanna is deeply unsentimental.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, she's a harsh woman, isn't she?
She's a very, very practical woman.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's part of the reason that her and Cal spend so much of their time separated is because she makes the very hard-headed practical decision that, like, this is not safe.
Yeah.
It is not safe for us to be together, so we won't be. And, again, talking of inversions, my God, like, it's always I just had to see you. I mean, how many times have we seen that scene?
Oh,
how many times?
Over and over.
Every time.
Yeah.
Right?
But no.
And it's always a catastrophe, right?
Totally. It always leads to disaster, doesn't it? But no, here it's actually played out in terms of its pragmatism.
Yeah. And the other thing I did want to mention as well, and I have, again, all I have is memories of it in terms of stylistic echo, because I can't remember the facts of what happens at the end of Imagica, and I'm going to reread it, so don't remind me. But
no worries.
What I do remember is that what Weaveworld, I think, in the climax has in common with that is he hits this point of storytelling where the action is happening on these parallel tracks, and he's just jumping from point of view to point of view and back again, and it is so smooth. It flows so effortlessly. The clock is always ticking. You're always looking at the place where there's the most action, but you're also always anxious about what's happening off camera that you can't see.
Yeah, it's so bloody good, isn't it?
And also, absolute fucking masterclass.
That setting, Raymond's Hill, in the middle of the UK, like in the fields and the hills with the snow, and you've got those two figures. You see Shadwell and Hobart coming over the horizon.
Yeah,
it's fantastic, and I love the way he uses the coat, the jacket to finally end it. It's so brilliant. It's so brilliant, and the fact that the angel, quote unquote, the fact that its desires and it's just that its state of being is so profound that it can make its desire real.
Yeah. And I just loved the fact that it most desired was itself, was companionship.
It wanted another of itself, because it was this lost. You never find out what Uriel is.
No.
But what you do know is you get suggestions that it's some divinity, it's some extra-dimensional entity that has become perverted by the stories of humanity.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's driven itself mad in isolation and has taken on this role from biblical story. And it's the worst of that. It's an angel of destruction.
Yeah, and yet weirdly, I mean, the as you say, it's left open, but there's at least the vague implication that what it might just be is it might just be an abandoned child.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Or at least like an abandoned exile of its race or something.
Yeah.
You know. But at the end, it gets some redemption too.
Yeah.
From its own madness.
No, it's so good.
From the imposed story. It's so fucking clever. It's how you feel sympathy for this thing that is just all the way through the story. It's been this engine of pain and of destruction and of what its name implies, the scourge.
Yeah.
And then you realise it's more than that.
Yeah, but interestingly as well, it also at the same time it destroys the coat, which is the other engine of misery throughout the book, right?
Of course.
So there's the ultimate transformation of this thing that has just been a source of relentless pain and misery, and has just driven all of the bad shit that's happened a lot of the time, and suddenly in the last its power becomes transformative for good. Yeah, and it destroys itself, but in the process it creates this kind of ascension, and it saves this situation.
Yeah, so something that's been wholly negative, just an engine of negativity, becomes the redeeming factor.
Yeah.
In the end.
See, it's really all about the coat.
in
coat as
a
Jesus.
weird kind of way, in this odd, strange little way, I suppose it is. I mean, the one character, I've always identified with is Gluck.
Right.
I love him, the little conspiracy theorist guy.
Yeah, I know, he's wonderful.
I
Wonderful
love
character.
him because he's
Yeah,
kind of the audience, isn't he?
Yeah, he is.
He's
Yeah,
the eyes
absolutely.
of the audience,
He's the super fan, right?
He
With
is,
his
he's the
nose
super
against the
fan.
glass. Yeah.
I love the fact that he gets what he wants.
Yep. No, it's adorable.
There's a lovely
It's absolutely
sequence
adorable.
where he comes amongst the seer kind, and because he's with Cal, they say something like "You're welcome," and he's like beside himself
Practically
with
faints,
happiness,
Oh, it's so great.
Oh, it's so cool. It is.
Well,
one of
and
my
he
favourite,
kind of saves the day too. Actually,
It is so
I mean,
well, yeah. Without him, Cal wouldn't have got there. So
that's right.
he
And
has
I love
a part
that.
to play.
I love that moment in the talking of the end sequence. I love that moment of Cal's last march. It's the moment when the car packs up and he gets himself, he gets himself padded up, and he goes, and it's just that the moment of realization. And again, it's not played. It's really interesting how Barker just cuts. He cuts against the impulse to melodrama that you might experience. He just very calmly acknowledges whatever happens, this is a one-way trip.
Yeah, this is what I've got to do, and that's the end of it. But
it's also like, I'm not going to make it back to this car. Like, I'm either going to freeze to death or I'm going to meet my destiny on that hill. But this is it. This is a one-way trip. And I just... because Cal is so calm and embraces it so calmly, you feel it as a reader. In a way that if he was kind of like, oh, what am I doing? Whatever, it would
rob the moment.
It would die on the page. You know?
It would rob the moment. There is a calmness to it all when they're all gathered on the hill.
Wow, there's a real stoicism to the heroes, both of them actually. That is, I would say, the quality that Cal and Susanna have in common. They're just so fucking stoic. They just get the fuck on with it.
Totally, yeah. And it's born out. It seems to be born out of the fact that they have what they want. They found it. They are human beings who have found what most can only dream of. Even if it is destroyed, even if they die because of it, they've had it.
Yeah.
For that brief moment, they've had it. And that's wonderful. There is something really wonderful about that, and a lesson to be learned. There is, without the finger wagging and without didactism, there is a lesson that wider culture can learn from this. That you don't need your life to be banal.
Yeah,
you don't need to want the banality that culture insists that you must adore.
Yeah.
You can be what you want. You can be better than this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know. There's a thing about just and tied in with all of that is the notion of love, just the notion of embracing love, and to be in love with the things you're in love with without kind of
without
fear of
compromise,
judgment.
and without neurosis, because their relationship
Yeah.
is so. It's so cool. It's a very enlightened relationship, I find, because it's not exclusive. It's not neurotic. They would not care about the fact that there are other people in one another's lives.
Yeah.
Their relationships are also very pragmatic in that way. It's like Jericho and Susanna. When the way it describes their relationship evolving is they decide to be lovers. I love that. I love that. It's a very enlightened way of looking at things. It really is. It's a very forward-thinking book. It's very progressive, I suppose, on almost every level.
And again, it does it all without the slightest fanfare.
Yeah.
Like if you're not, if you don't engage with it, intellectually, then it's just there. It's just part of the story.
That's right.
I mean, I think part of what gives it the power is the way that Barker just treats it as a completely, makes no big deal about it at all. He's just like, yeah, this is it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. He is not trying to write a social tract or a screed or anything like that. No. And I don't even think that if you read the story that you would come away thinking that, in any way, shape or form. Whatever messages or significances are in this book, they come after the fact. They come with contemplation, I find, and with rereading very often. As I said, I've read this book God knows how many times, and every single time I'm finding these new significances. I'm finding these new bits and pieces coming up, like the polyamorous thing that you were talking about earlier. I don't think I consciously noticed that until you mentioned it, even though it's obviously there.
Yeah. But it's very unfussily. It's very unfussily there, though. That's the thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, it's just the thing that happens in the story. So why would
sense. It makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
And it's beautifully done. It's beautifully laid out. It's beautifully written. The erotic sequences in the book are fantastic, as they often are in Barker's stories. They often are. Interestingly, he very rarely writes homoeroticism.
I was just thinking that as you were saying it, I was running through it, and because I mentioned the heteronormativity earlier, and it is, he writes straight sex pretty well. I got to say,
he does, and it's interesting, isn't it? That
it works.
I understand why he does it in Weaveworld. because of the
it's the archetypes he's playing with. Yeah, exactly.
Totally.
Yeah.
If you want to see him writing about homoeroticism, then you need to go to Sacrament.
Right.
Which is one I would love to talk to you about at some point.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
That's a stone cold stunner, that is.
Okay. I'll add it to the list.
Yeah, that's the book that a lot of there's a lot of critics, and there's a lot of there's this preconception in academia. There's a lot of academics who are very snifty about popular horror writers and popular fantasy writers. They don't really have a place or whatever. Sacrament is the one that you'll find on university courses.
Okay.
Yeah, it's very bloody good. It's like, wow.
Okay.
It's it's one of those weird things where I will always adore Weaveworld, probably above and beyond everything that Barker's ever written, because A, it was the first, and B, it's just that book for me. It is that book that changed so much.
Yeah.
It changed so much in the way I think and perceive, and the way my imagination works. It unlocked it for me. This was the key, basically. This was the key to all of the weirdness. Anything I write about, anything that pops out of my very, very strange, fevered imagination, this is part of it. It's a core part of it. It allowed me to see on that level. It allowed me to imagine on that level. So I will always, always hold this very dear in my heart. But Sacrament is the better written book.
Right. Okay.
Oh, without a shadow of a doubt.
Okay.
It's a masterpiece. It's an absolute bloody masterpiece. It really is. And it's the only one Barker ever wrote about the experience of being a gay man.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, because he's not. I mean, I get the impression with Barker. It's an interesting thing. The parallel I think of with Barker is Ken Russell, where Russell's a filmmaker who, from a very solid, working class background. I mean, but he, I mean, Russell would be quite disdainful of other directors from working class backgrounds who spent all their time making movies about being working class and working class people. Like he'd get quite angry about it. Russell could be quite, I mean, I actually think he'd be a bit obnoxious about it personally, because I think there's room for that kind of filmmaking, but Russell would be very like, why the fuck would you want to do that? Like, you can make movies, fucking movies,
Totally. I also
they're
think,
giving you the money, do something fucking amazing. And I feel like there's that with Barker. I feel like there's this, I mean, because Weaveworld this is the thing about Weaveworld is, it feels like, as it is a novel, it is an epic novel, it is an epic fantasy novel, it also feels like a manifesto.
Yes. Oh, bloody hell, yeah. He's laying it out.
Yeah.
He's telling you, basically, this is what I perceive, this is what I want from reality,
Yep.
Totally.
And also, this is what you can do. Mm-hmm. These are the limits of your imagination, i.e. there are none.
Exactly. Just let it go.
Just fucking let it fly, And it's ultimately such a positive book. I mean, that was the other thing that this read really did for me. Because as a kid, I did remember, I retained the horror stuff, because obviously that's what I was tuned into at the time. but I was so struck by it's just a fundamentally such a positive
It is,
book.
isn't it? It's
It's
very
such an
hopeful
uplifting,
piece.
yeah.
And on a very human level as well. It is very. It makes you feel gratified to be human, which is not something you can feel that often. It's a very beautiful thing. He does celebrate the beauty of humanity, but without compromise as well. But he doesn't ignore the ugliness.
No, absolutely, and I think that's really impressive. And for me, that's maybe encapsulated in the descriptive word that he uses for humans of cuckoo, which I think is such a great phrase. Because
an epithet.
I mean, it is, and it is obviously. There are obviously ways in which it's a pejorative, right?
Oh, yeah.
It's what the seer kind describe humans as, because it's like, you look like us, but you're not.
But you're most definitely not.
But you eat all the fucking worms and then you kick us out the nest because you're wankers, And of course, that's the thing, isn't it? Like, the human villains are driven by, these motivations that the seer kind just can't comprehend. They just don't like. They see the world as it is, and like, why the fuck, money? Like, who gives a shit?
Who gives two shits about that? Yeah, absolutely.
Possibly care? Their ambition is like the perfect poem. The great sonnet, the next song. That's
They're
ambition.
Pure inspiration, aren't they? That's what they want. They are pure art and craft and creation.
And I mean, and agriculture and
architecture, everything else, everything creative
absolutely.
and good and noble,
Yeah. But I just think, I don't know, I think the phrase cuckoo is really interesting because, of course, it also, there's a way in which I think it applies to creatives. I think that there is always that, there is, and I don't want to harp on too much about this because I hate, I don't want to give the impression that I'm not a happy person, because I actually kind of am. I've got a pretty fucking good life and I'm pretty well settled, and I love what I do, and I'm very fortunate to be able to do it. It is observable when you meet other writers that one of the great reliefs about meeting other writers is you are surrounded by people who understand what you're doing in a way that most people don't.
Yep.
And there is always that feeling when you're out in the world and you're talking to quote unquote normal people, and the subject of writing comes up, and you feel like we're not quite the same.
There is a fundamental distance, isn't there? And I think that's true of anyone who wants to express something. In an artistic or creative way. In order to have that impulse, there must be something you perceive that's wrong, or that doesn't satisfy you in some way. You want to fundamentally comment upon and change the world as a result, or the state of humanity. And I think Barker is one of those great writers who acknowledges if you don't want to do that, then don't do it.
Yeah, exactly. And and I mean, I think there's, the ego side of it. I always sort of say, I think writing's like, I think at its base, and this isn't a terribly flattering analogy, but I think writing is graffiti. We're trying to graffiti our names onto history. We want something of us to live on past us.
I think that's absolutely true. Yeah, there is a legacy quality to it, isn't there? Definitely.
And I think that's kind of a big part of the impulse is about, and that goes beyond writing. That's art, right? Any art. It's about yelling out, "I'm here," or "I was here."
At one time, beyond just these vague memories and the bones that are left. Yeah,
exactly. In this time, in this place, I lived, I felt, I thought, I had stuff going on. And I think the feeling, the word cuckoo is interesting because in the context of the book, it's used to describe humanity, and humanity is seen as separate from that creative impulse somehow.
Yeah, and that's interesting, isn't it? Because Barker would definitely, I imagine, place himself amongst the seer kind.
Yeah, right. Although maybe not. Maybe it speaks to that feeling of imposter syndrome, right? Maybe so,
yeah. Which, of course, is very, very common amongst all artists and creatives. We all feel that we're illegitimate, that we're sort of playing at it, rather than getting it right.
And I can't imagine that Barker didn't experience some anxieties at some point writing this thing, right? Because he's playing with these giant archetypes. He's playing with these absolutely, elemental, especially for like, British fantasy literature.
Yes, which
he's playing with like
he's playing with fire is what he's doing.
He's playing with foundational texts, and he's deliberately subverting them. He's deliberately doing dangerous things with them. I mean, the push-pull between anxiety and ego there must have been quite something. And I don't know, it just struck me as I kept seeing the word cuckoo jump out at me. The implications of it are really interesting. I mean, I like the idea that it's saying, I like the way that it's the way for the seer kind of say, no, you're the fucking imposters.
Yeah, you're the bloody imposters. That's another interesting thing, isn't it? For like a fantasy-based text. Because very often there is this horrible, slightly biblical thing going on in fantasy-based text where humanity is resplendent and is the prime mover,
Oh, I call it human chauvinism.
Yeah.
In fantasy literature and in science fiction often as well. And it's maybe inescapable because everyone so far that's writing this stuff is human.
At the moment.
It might not be something you can avoid. But I think Barker's trying here.
Yeah.
I do.
I really
even
do.
though the story's told from the perspective of the humans, I think that term for me feels very much like the seer kind saying like, no, you guys are the...
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Because that ties back to what we were talking about earlier about this being a very gay text, despite the fact that it has no overtly gay people in it. Because that's Barker's status as a gay man, That is Barker's status, that sense of being an imposter in society, of not having the meta-narratives and the prescribed narratives that apply to, say, his straight brother and his father apply to him. Society basically telling you that, no, you are a cuckoo, you're not supposed to be here.
Yeah. And that's interesting too, though, isn't it? Because also that's the thing that we know is that the arts historically have been quite a relatively...
pervaded by LGBTQ people. It's absolutely true.
Well, I was going to say unusually sort of relatively welcoming and safe space.
Well, that
I
too.
think,
but there is I think that the reason that stereotype, I don't know whether it's still as true. It probably isn't as true now, ironically, because we've made some headway into, I suppose, invading those meta-narratives that didn't, and those roles that didn't apply to us before, i.e. the roles of like the husband and the wife and of the father and the mother. That has perhaps eroded the status of the exile that traditionally has pushed us towards the arts. So maybe it's not as true anymore. But it was a true stereotype at one time.
Well, and I think it's just, there's something about that. I mean, seeking out an environment where you can be accepted, and also there's that really complicated relationship between, the ability to express yourself. Art as expression, and I guess if you've got this situation where, something as elemental and fundamental to humanity as your desire is something that you're not allowed to express in ways that others are.
Absolutely. It's got to come out, hasn't it? It's got to express itself in some other way. It's got to be commented upon. Any
avenue you can find that will allow you the freedom of expression that day-to-day life doesn't is going to be enormously appealing, I would have thought.
Absolutely, yeah. There's definitely that. It's something that isn't as overt in Weaveworld with this sort of outside looking in thing. It's obviously there. It's certainly a fundamental part of the story, but it's not to say activist in this as it is in, interestingly, the Books of Blood.
But interestingly too, I think as we develop the metaphor, the Weaveworld feels very much like a queer space to me.
Yeah. Oh yeah. So it's totally totally.
It's queer Wonderland, right? Well, I mean, that's a redundancy. Maybe Wonderland's inherently queer.
I would say that the weave would be. I imagine if Barker ever if he'd ever developed, say, another story in the Weaveworld, that it would have been very clear that notions like sexual orientation would be meaningless in the Weaveworld.
Again, it feels fairly heavily implied even in this text. It is there. If you want it, it's not far beneath the surface.
Yeah, gender. What would that mean? You actually have that sequence in the Orchard of Lemuel Lowe, where the two performers, the brother and the sister, that are almost androgynous, almost almost beyond identification merge with one another, then swap places with one another.
Yeah.
I mean, the commentary there is fairly overt, isn't it?
Yeah, I would say.
Yeah.
I would say. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because that is an idea that takes further development, if I remember rightly, in Imagica.
Oh God, Pyopa.
Thank you. Yes.
The Mystiff, a creature that it's not even that it has no sex, or that it's a combination of the sexes. It actually is a sex unto itself.
Yeah.
So it actually operates beyond the spectrum of male and female.
Yeah.
I mean, what the fuck?
What a great character.
What an amazing concept.
Yeah.
What a freaking amazing concept.
Yeah.
And I tell you what, if there's ever such a character as an innocent in Barker, it's Pyopa.
That's my memory, yeah.
Pyopa is a beautiful character. Pyopa is a entirely sympathetic entity.
Yeah.
And well, you know what happens to innocents in these stories. It's not. It's tragic. It's entirely tragic. It
rarely ends well.
Stunning. Yeah. What a fucking brilliant concept that is, though. It's just like Barker. Leave something for the rest of us, please. God, man.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's what can you say? I mean, like, emotionally, how did this affect you this time round?
That's really interesting, and I think, as I say, the thing I'd forgotten was the joy. The thing I'd forgotten was the love and the kind of the energy of that. So that, and I think as well, I think I've gained more perspective maybe on the villains. I just found them less scary this time around than I did as a kid, and I think that's probably about my own. I mean, I don't think that's anything to do with the text. I think that's about your own
evolution as a
absolutely,
person,
and my own kind of relationships to authority and various other things. I think I found Shadwell more almost as much pitiable as detestable this time around, which is interesting because I think he was a figure of almost complete hate for me as a teenager, and I don't, I stand by that to a degree. I think he is contemptible, but I found the thing with him was he felt very much to be a creature of fate, in that he was completely consumed and driven by desire. I mean, so it's almost like there's almost like an addiction metaphor with him.
Totally. Because he defines at the beginning, because he defines exclusively as the salesman. He's got no other identity whatsoever.
Yeah.
It's like he's driven by that identity, isn't it? There's nothing else to him.
And what an empty identity to embrace.
Totally.
What a non-identity to embrace. What a strange choice.
Yeah.
And Hobart, similar sort of things for him. Really, I think he was a character who he was a character who I absolutely detested.
As a kid, I loathed Hobart.
Yeah.
Hobart was the one I hated the most as a kid.
Yeah.
But the more I've read it, the more I've realised there is real sympathy in this book for him.
Well, I think the thing about Hobart is what makes him perhaps less morally objectionable than Shadwell is that Hobart ultimately... he asks for the release. He offers his throat to the dragon.
He does.
Realizes,
he knows, doesn't he?
Does.
He knows that he's not for this world.
Yeah.
That he can't function in it, and it's wearying. When he sheds the dragon.
Yeah.
In the sort of fairy tale scape that him and Susanna operate in, he's left as this wounded, broken knight. He's got nothing left. Whatever cause he's fighting for, he knows it's empty. He knows that the justice that he presumes to serve doesn't exist.
Yeah.
That the law, it's this empty, broken thing. He knows. Part of him knows. And there is a level of sympathy there, and that escalates. That escalates after the scourge possesses him.
Yeah.
Because,
absolutely.
It shows him in many respects why the dragon is not necessarily a good thing to want to be.
And even the moment of his possession, right? I mean, that's the thing, is that he becomes he's kind of like Shadwell's last victim, right? He's the last. Really, he's the last. Because the interesting thing with Shadwell, arguably Shadwell's arc is that he just runs out of people to betray.
Yeah. Yes, yeah.
You know, like his mistake was not recruiting someone before going up to the hill, but relying on Hobart, because like he literally just ran out of people to turn on,
to dupe,
you know?
Basically. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Of course, that's a fair point. Actually, if Shadwell were as intent on the ideology that he adopts at the end of the book, i.e., the sort of anti-magic jihad, surely he would have taken the scourge into himself.
Yeah.
You know, if he genuinely believed it.
Yeah, I mean, but I think that speaks to the inherent cravenness of him.
Oh, yeah. Like, totally.
Which means, you know, you're right. But at bottom, there is no bottom. That's the thing, isn't it? Like, there is no
He is just an abyss,
conviction.
isn't he? He's just an abyss of nothing. Yeah. No dreams, no inspiration, nothing. He is the worst. He's the worst of humanity. He is the CEO. He's he's the director of the Fortune 500 company. He is that guy.
Yeah.
Who doesn't want anything else. That's what he believes power is. That's what he believes desire is. That's everything becomes subsumed to that, to the material, which of course is nothing, is emptiness. It's like, I can see why Barker kind of has such contempt for that character.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which he does. He does.
Yeah, and I think, you know, but I think that's a really, there's something very powerful about that. And it, you know, I mean, again, I don't want to lean too heavily on the politics, because Barker doesn't.
No, he doesn't. He's you know, it's not about politics for Barker. No. It's really not. It's about humanity.
But it is there if you want it.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, totally. If you want to read that subtext into it, definitely it's there. Yeah. But he very early on in his career stated that he believes politics. He's kind of anarchist. He believes politics to be the arena of dead men. Yeah. That there's nothing good that can come out of it, or out of the traditions that inform it. So, which is why he focuses on the metaphysical.
Yeah.
And on the abstract.
Yeah. Yeah, I could see that, but I also think, I don't know, I think that I mean, I think that story is his obsession at the end of the day as well. I think that it's, you know, and I mean, and again, I think that's where I got to with it, this is just so clearly a love note to the notion of creation itself, to the notion of creative imagination itself. And I found that just so great, and just, you know, a real kind of boost, a real kind of lift, and a bit of a kick in the pants as well, you know, like
it's earnest as well,
yeah,
isn't it? You know, it's not,
you know what, actually
that's
a really good point. It's tough, and it is sometimes it's brutal. It is never cynical.
Nope.
Never. There isn't a single like cynical expression. There is occasionally despair.
Oh yeah, but it's genuine, isn't it? It's genuine despair. I think that's the point. It's sincerity. That's what I get from this, and it sounds really terrible, but it does seem to me that one of the problems of the liberation of publishing and writing and whatnot. I mean, actually, it's not a problem of that, because it's actually true of mainstream publishing and stuff that's put out by publishing houses too. But it's insincerity. I often read stories that I feel are insincere, or they're not what the writer genuinely wants to say, or what they genuinely believe. And that, to me, I hate that.
Yeah.
I don't want that. I don't
want
I
agree.
You know, I don't see the point of it existing. If you're not going to write something that you feel, then don't do it.
No, I completely agree. I'm increasingly I'm increasingly struggling even with just cynicism at the moment as a kind of remotely useful response to the world that we find ourselves in.
Absolutely.
I really strongly feel that we've gotten to the point where it's kind of an indulgence we can't afford.
Oh yeah, I mean,
as a species,
it's very difficult, I find, to keep from not just cynicism but nihilism. You know,
right?
It's very hard.
I think nihilism's the more honest response to where we are. I think that cynicism's gotten to the point where it's actively harmful.
Yeah,
because the point is not because it's not a valid reaction necessarily, but because it pretty much is as bad as you think it is.
Oh, absolutely,
if not worse.
And it's
And at that point, just going, oh, well, there's fuck all to be done. Like, no.
No, absolutely.
Now is the time.
Now is the time to do it. Now is the time to do it.
Whatever it is, get the fuck on with it.
Yeah. And it doesn't have to be like some grand revolutionary statement. You can make things better.
Yeah, exactly.
Just by something very simple. Something very simple. Doing like what we do. Just writing something that's true. Creating something that's beautiful, or that just enlivening someone's existence somehow, inspiring them to do something. That's all you need. And Weaveworld is one of those things. It is a star. It's a shining star, of beauty and of inspiration in a world that can be very, very grim and very dark and very cynical in and of itself.
Yeah, and I think what's clever about the story is the cynicism exists, but it's the cynicism is the other, right? Mm-hmm. That's the bit that's outside. It's not. It doesn't infect the characters. They experience its results.
Yeah.
They
its
experience
consequences.
Its consequences. But they themselves. I mean, there's a line. It's funny. I discovered as I was reading it. I was 3/4 of the way through before I realized this would happen. But I was reading it on the Kindle this time, and if you highlight text on the Kindle, it pulls through to your Goodreads account, so you can just see the stuff you've highlighted as you go through. And there was a line from near the end where it's this is the scourge is starting to kill people, and it was it's from the end of the sequence where they've gone back to the house because the seer kind of desperately trying to find
they're trying to find some artifact of the old sciences, aren't they?
Yeah, they're just trying to get as much power together as they can, basically, aren't they?
That's
they're just
right.
trying to rally, and they've gone there, and the baddies turn up, and the line is so this guy's just seen his friends immolated, and he's running out, and I think he's injured himself, and it says in his rage and his despair, De Bono found himself saying, "Let it come, let it come." There were no safe places left, nor powers to protect the vulnerable, so let it do its worst. If that at the last was inevitable, let the void come and bring an end to the tyranny of hope.
Oh, yes, I remember that line.
And it's just like, fucking hell. Because we've talked about, this is ultimately a very positive book, but it does have moments like that, and it doesn't pull its punches.
No, I remember that sequence, actually. And I remember reading it for the first time, and it is horrible.
Yeah.
It's powerfully unpleasant. It's but what Barker's trying to do is show you why it's called the Scourge.
Yeah, that's right.
And why it's such a thing. He's trying to build it up. Because you get the echoes of it all the way through the book.
Yeah.
You get references to it. Immaculata talks about it first, because she can hear it. She can feel it stirring.
And the fact that Immaculata's scared of it is kind of what gives you... That's your first clue, like, okay, this is really bad
Immaculata is scared of this thing. I mean, what? What? And ironically, in that state, it's kind of analogous to her as well, because it's like ultimate purity as well. Maybe that's why she's scared of it. It's a purity that just outshines hers.
Yeah. But I think it's the difference between, you see, that's the thing. I think that's the thing where she's the villain, but she has a place within the story. That thing is the death of story itself.
It is. It's the death of magic, isn't it?
Yeah,
like literally the
right.
death of magic. So the death of miracles. And what world will it leave behind? This empty, desolate, burnt, black world. It's the world. It's Shadwell's world.
Well, this is it, and it's an interesting thing, isn't it? Because the other thing I think about when I'm thinking about death by fire, and I'm thinking of the 80s, the other thing obviously that I'm thinking about is the Cold War and the atom bomb. And it's kind of it kind of carbon dates people of my generation, really. That's something, because no one gives a fuck about that anymore, and they shouldn't. By the way, you should be worried about global warming, because that is the thing that's going to kill us.
Oh yeah,
it's not it's not going to be nuclear holocaust. It's going to be
it's going to be actually far more insidious than that, sadly.
Yeah, it's going to be rising sea levels, but there is the ghost of that, I think, in the fact that because there's the point where the Scourge basically says, let's just kill everything.
Yeah, actually it does, doesn't it? It's where Shadwell's losing control, isn't it, over it?
Yeah, that's right.
It doesn't say something like, what if we burned everything? What a fire that would be. It's something like that, isn't it?
Yeah. And to me, that's a pretty clear stand-in for the nuclear annihilation, mutually assured destruction. Which again is that's a very,
at the time, it again felt like a very inevitably human thing to do. And I mean, climate change is just a different iteration of that, right?
Exactly. Yes, it's
the same basic folly. The root sin is the same, if you will.
Absolutely, and the root concern is the same as well. It seems to be something that crops up again and again and again and again throughout, certainly, the history of the 20th century and the 21st century.
I think you can probably trace it back to World War One. I think you can probably, that's the first iteration, because it's just the spasm of violence. It's the enormous scar it left on the the entire generation that did survive it, and it was the all of the amazing power of imagination and ingenuity of the human mind being poured solely into the task of destroying
solely into atrocity.
The human body.
Solely into atrocity.
That's right.
That would make a great title for something.
Well, funny you say that, because the line I'm looking at as we're having this conversation that I highlighted, this is from very near the end of the book, and it's Susanna. She was so transfixed by the formidable power being unleashed in front of her, she couldn't avert her astonished gaze. It fascinated her that strength of this magnitude should be turned to the sordid business of atrocity. Something was wrong with the reality that made that possible.
There you go.
Offered no cure for it, nor hope of cure.
There you go. Well, that's the politics of the book. I mean, if you want to talk about the politics of the book, there it is. That's the encapsulation of the politics of the book. It's why Barker loathes the notion of enshrined politics and the mechanisms of politics, because to him that's what it is.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's what it is. It's this impotent grinding engine of misery and of impotence, of powerful impotence. At worst, corrosive and destructive. At best, impotent and pointless. It's why he turns to other things. It's why he looks for hope in other things. I'd be very interested to see... I mean, I don't know what's going to happen with Barker and his writing from this point on. I've actually heard some interesting echoes just today that apparently we're going to be getting another book in the Abarat series and another book in the books of the art.
Wow.
I don't know what that means. I don't know what form that's going to take at this point, because Barker, I imagine, is a very different guy at this point.
Yeah. I mean, it's really...
all the experiences that he's had recently, and
well, I mean, the only interview I've heard with him was he did an interview on the Nerdist podcast. This is post the illness,
right,
and it's the only one I'm really aware of. And it's very telling. The interview was 2 sort of 3/4 hour sessions, and they were actually recorded almost a year apart.
Right, because of his illness.
So he recorded. So they were both post illness. So they were both post the kind of. But he got the first one. Ends quite abruptly after about 30 or 40 minutes. He just says, "You know what? Can we just?" I mean, he doesn't sound hurt or anything. He's just like, "You know what? I'm getting tired. Can we take a break?"
Yeah.
And they don't even get back to it for a year.
Wow.
And you think, like, that's. I mean, he came about as close to dying as you can come.
I know. I've read the accounts of it. He was most people who get what he got die.
Yeah,
most people do. Toxic shock is it's an absolute killer, because most people don't know they've got it until it just shuts your systems down. You just die. And then he went into a coma, and then he came out of the coma and went back into the coma. He's lucky. I saw some video footage of him shortly after, and it was one of the only events that he'd attended, and he looked like death.
Yeah,
he looked awful, and it was just like, get well, Clive. Get well.
Well, I mean, he didn't do. His health prevented him from doing a signing tour for Scarlet Gospels, which he's always done signing tours for his books, and he just could not do it. I mean, he just wasn't physically capable of doing it.
So,
and I mean, if you can't, don't, for God's sake.
Oh, bloody hell! If you physically can't, just don't do it.
Take all the time you need. Do whatever.
Absolutely.
And the other thing is, I think my impression. I haven't been following it close up. I think he's still painting.
Oh yeah, so I understand. He's still very, very into the painting. Probably not at the output that he was when he first started publishing the Abarat, because he was doing 30 odd paintings a day by all accounts at that point. It's just craziness, There is some great footage of him actually in his studio doing his painting and whatnot, and it's like he's such a like it's a delight.
Yeah.
It's like being a kid and having canvas and paint and a big room where you can just chuck it about and just paint with your fingers and with whatever comes to hand, you know. It's like, oh man, to be in that position. To have that freedom and not have the concern of stuff like money and whatnot, and be able to just be purely creative.
Yeah.
That's like paradise insofar as I'm concerned. That's where we should be aspiring to. All human beings should be aspiring to that condition, you know.
But I'm kind of grateful that there's at least a few people like Barker out there living it. You know.
Oh, Jesus Christ! Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful. But whether these books will ever manifest, I don't know, and what they'll be, what shape they'll take. I have no idea. I have no idea.
No.
But it doesn't really matter to me whilst there are because of the fact that Weaveworld and its like have occurred. You know?
I mean, I think that run Weaveworld to Magica and you know, I'd throw probably Cabal in there and
totally,
Thief of All Ways.
Yeah.
You know, like it's just untouchable.
Yeah,
it's absolutely peerless.
It's like it's like the zenith, isn't it? It's like it's so difficult. I mean, this is the problem I had with Barker actually. After I discovered him, I found it very hard reading a lot of other writers. Because he's so bloody good.
Oh, I mean, when you read someone that good at the top of their game, it's really hard. It makes everyone else feel sort of washed out and separate by comparison. It's really unfair because it's just
well, you know, and I must say a lot of his contemporaries took it with very good grace. You know, I mean,
that's true.
Think, you know, in that letter King sent, he said about Barker when he was like 30, like late 20s, early 30s. He said he's better than I am now.
Yeah.
You know,
well, you think. You know, I always think about it in musical terms. I think about what, you know, that apocryphal story of like, you know, whatever nightclub it was in London, the day that, you know, Hendrix played in the UK for the first time and Eric Clapton just stood there and just like, shit, you know, like that's me done then, you know, like that's absolutely everything I was ever trying to do a million times better. Like.
But it's wonderful, isn't it? I love the fact that this kind of stellar, blazing, blinding ability exists.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And it's, you know, and like that, I mean, I was kind of riffing on that run, you know, it's for me that run of Barker, it's like the Stones from 67 to 72. It's like the Beatles from Rubber Soul till they split up. It's like, you know, it's like that The Who in their Imperial phase with the singles and Tommy and, you know, Who's Next, that kind of amazing run of, it's just peerless art.
It's amazing.
And art that just belongs to that creative force too. I mean, that's the other thing. He has a voice. You know, he has a style. He has there's a feel to Barker's work.
Oh, you know when you're reading a Barker.
Yeah,
you know when you're reading
absolutely.
a Barker. You definitely do. And he's got something to say. I think that's another thing as well. He wants to change the world.
Oh,
you know? He wants to change
absolutely.
Humanity in these books. I don't know whether he still does, but with that run of books, he wants. It's revolutionary. You know, these books, as quiet as Weaveworld is in that regard, they're calls to arms in many respects.
They are. Absolutely. No, and like we said, it's there if you want it. But what he will not do is he absolutely will not compromise any of the characters or the story for a second to crowbar in a message. He just won't do it.
Definitely not. Definitely not. Which is a problem with a lot of writers I really like, to be honest.
Yeah.
I always think of, say, His Dark Materials or something like that, which is a series I absolutely friggin' adore. I think it's a beautiful series of books. I really do. But there is a problem where sometimes the story it falters because of the agenda. It's definitely true. Lewis is probably the classic example of this, you know?
Yeah, I mean, Lewis arguably breaks it, doesn't he?
Oh, well, points. I mean, the last book in the Narnia series, The Last Battle, is actually abhorrent. It's actually abhorrent, certainly to an adult eye. And it does affect the rest of the stories massively.
And yet, I think the weird part is if you just let it go, you tend to do better anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like I was thinking about. I mean, I did a podcast recently about the long walk, and one of the things we talked
I
about
listened
there
to
was
it.
like, oh, okay,
Yeah, it was
so
very good.
like, thank you, but like, I mean, in my conclusion, one of the things I said was I think it's one of the best depictions of what it must feel like to live inside a fascistic society that's ever existed. Like it's perfect. You get the hopelessness and the fear and the internalized hatred and the normalized brutality, all of that stuff. It's all, and the thing is, it's not. At its core, it's a book about a fucking bunch of kids being forced to do an impossible thing. It's about that. It's not, that none of that is. This is not message fiction.
No, it's ambient, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's ambient in the world.
But it has stuff to tell you, and it tells you just by telling you the story and setting the world up and letting your mind do the fucking work.
That demonstrates an understanding of how people do take messages or learn things, because didactism doesn't work. We know this from myriad studies. If you tell people things or instruct people in things or give them books about things that are instructional, they don't learn. They don't learn anything.
No, that's right.
If you present them in sort of a roundabout way, through metaphor, through stories, through art, through like things that they can do in games or whatever, or in tasks, then they learn. Then they remember.
Yeah, but the other thing is, if you commit as hard as you can to telling the story as honestly as you can, that shit will just get in there.
Yeah.
It will just happen.
Because it's honest. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, I know it sounds like a slightly sort of pretentious writerly thing to say, but it's absolutely true. If it's honest, then you will snare something.
But the other thing about that is, what's nice about that is you'll do it even if you don't. I mean, I always think there's a couple of writers I always think about that, like Conan Doyle and Fleming, who are authors I absolutely adore, whose politics are abhorrent in the extreme.
Oh,
they are
totally
vile. But the thing is, because they wrote so honestly, they actually condemn themselves and their own political positions in the writing.
Oh, the work is wiser than the man. Yeah, totally. It happens often.
Way wiser.
Happens often.
And I just think,
often.
Commit to honesty with the writing, and that shit will take care of itself.
Absolutely.
It really will.
Yeah.
And you might not come out of it looking very good, but that's your problem.
But
the work,
the work will sustain, won't it?
That's right.
The work will sustain. It's like Lovecraft, isn't it? Abhorrent man in many respects in terms of his perspectives and whatnot. But the work sustains, and the work has inspired such good things.
Yep, absolutely.
Down the line, because it is wiser. It's wiser than the man ever was.
Well, and also I think the perspective is one that creates an incredible sense of horror. That feeling of that level of alienation, that level of like visceral fear of the other.
Yeah.
That's an incredible space to occupy in fiction. To as a reader, to be put in that place is really, that's incredibly powerful.
It is, and it's to be sharing. And again, I do think there's an honesty in that, because I do think the man was scared of everything.
Yeah.
He was scared of everything, and that's what he's expressing. And that's why it's sustained. I believe there is honesty in it, even though some of his politics does sometimes come through, and that's disgusting, and we have to deal with that as part of it. There is still that fundamental human element, which is identifiable and universal.
And I think the mistake sometimes that gets made in this kind of conversation when people hear it, especially if they're lovers of the artist that you're talking about, is they don't. I think there can sometimes be a misunderstanding that because you're saying that there are elements of the art that are politically difficult or unpleasant or immoral or whatever, or even elements of the artists themselves that were objectionable. None of that invalidates the art.
No, it does not. It does not. You have to judge the art on its own basis ultimately. I mean, don't get me wrong, authorial intent and the nature of the author will obviously have some influence over the nature of the text. There's no doubt about that. But it's more complex. It's way more complex than the author did or felt or believed this, and therefore the text has no worth or no meaning.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
It is very much the case that something good can come from something bad. Like Lewis, again, I keep going back to Lewis, but Lewis ultimately, when he wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, was trying to program children with his very particular form of Christianity. But I didn't get that when I read it. It fails fundamentally on that level from the author's intent. It fails fundamentally because it fails to understand the way children work on an imaginative level. Most children read it not getting that at all. They just see a really inspiring, fun fantasy story.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, it ultimately, let's face it, for both of us, it ended up leading us by the hand to Barker. Right?
Oh, God, yeah. The Chronicles of Narnia were the first books I ever read as a kid.
Yeah.
When I was like 4, I think, when I read the Chronicles of Narnia. Yeah, so without them, I would not have come to so many others. I would not have developed in the way that I did. My imagination probably wouldn't have taken the shape that it did. So... yeah. And it doesn't mean that you can't comment upon these other aspects of the work and of the writer in and of themselves. It's complex in that regard. It's complex, and the complexity itself is well worth commenting upon.
Yeah, I agree, and I just think as well. I think there's a fundamental. I just think there's a fundamental thing about insight. I think that I keep coming back to the notion that you've got to, you have to understand. You have to understand how people work, and that includes people you disagree with, people you passionately dislike, people that are your enemy. You have to understand all of them.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
And you do. I think the thing that I always push back against is dehumanization. That's always, I think, the most dangerous thing you can ever do is label someone as a monster.
Yes.
I think as soon as you do that,
you've lost.
Well, you're not just lost; you've abdicated moral responsibility. I think at that point,
yeah,
I think
you don't have to engage, do you?
Exactly.
You don't have to engage.
It's a failure.
And don't get me wrong. I understand the impulse. It's easy to do. It's really bloody easy to do.
Yeah. And there are people who behave monstrously, right? I mean, there are monstrous ideologies at large in the world, and they need to be combated. They need to be fought and stood up against, and and resisted and challenged. But it's actually a strategic error to label human beings as monsters. It really is. It's a strategic failure.
Yep.
And it leads you to dangerous places and puts you in danger every time.
Absolutely.
You've got to reckon with the humanity of the people that you're against, especially the people you're against.
Yeah. You've got to understand where it comes from. I mean, again, bringing it back to Weaveworld, it seems to be one of the, in fact, not just Weaveworld, but Barker's fiction in general. He does that so well.
Yeah.
You'll rarely find a monster that's entirely monstrous.
Yeah.
In Barker's fiction.
Yeah.
Very rarely. In fact, very often you'll find books like Cabal, where it's the inverse.
Yeah.
You have the inverse of the standard, of the horror standard, where it's actually the forces of order and humanity that are malevolent entirely. The psychiatrist, the priest, the police.
Yeah. No, I mean in this book, the humans are absolutely the bad guys.
Oh yeah,
in
totally.
Weaveworld. With two honourable exceptions.
Two honourable exceptions, yeah.
You become like honourable seer, become like, elevated to sort of pseudo seer kind status.
Yes, in their own ways, yeah. But man, I honestly don't know what else to say. This book is one of the most important to me that I've ever come across. And
I would say this as well. I think you were lucky that this came into your life when it did.
Yeah.
Because at that age, your mind is ready for a text that's going to be defining. You could have done a shitload worse, man.
Absolutely. Well, I could have carried on with Lord of the Rings. I don't know what would have happened if that would have been the case.
If that was the case, right now, your entire life would be making angry podcasts about George R. R. Martin.
It's entirely possible.
Finishing his books.
It's entirely possible, yeah. That would be bad. I'm very glad. No, it is one of those things. It's one of those just chance things I'm very grateful happened.
Yeah.
It's just one of those things that it just happened arbitrarily and changed everything.
Yep.
Absolutely everything in my young life. So I don't know what else to say about it other than that.
Well, yeah. There you go.
Well, I think, shall we draw it to a close there, Kit?
I'm happy, man. Yep.
Fabulous. I think
Absolutely.
that I don't think we could really say anything more about it. I think we've drained that one dry. So, is there anything that you would like to talk about or to draw people to? Anything you'd like to pimp out?
I mean, I guess the usual plug is Patreon, right? So if you've enjoyed what you've heard here, I've got a Patreon. The way it's working at the moment is that if you pledge $1 a month, every single week you'll get exclusive content from me. So that may be anything from a new piece of fiction, a new piece of non-fiction, or a book review, or my life in horror, or a podcast, because I also run a podcast, Watching Robocop with Kit Power.
Yes, you may have heard that one,
Which
ladies and
you
gents.
you may have heard mentioned
You
before.
may have heard that one a couple of times, yes.
So yeah, so basically it's $1 a month, and I use it to pay for the hosting costs of the podcast, and obviously I'm trying to move towards a more sustainable footing for the writing as well.
Of course.
And as I said, you know, it's what it basically is early access. So most of the stuff you read on there will eventually be published elsewhere, but you're getting it first, and you're getting it in draft form. And at higher tiers, if you want to back for a little bit more, you can sit and watch me write once a week. I'll open up a Google Doc, and you'll have a link, and you can actually watch the words appear on the page. And you know, I'm giving out ebooks and stuff like that. So you know,
excellent.
Patreon.com/Kit Power. Give it a look, see if anything there tickles your fancy. I mean, you know, I'm a terrible salesman. Most of it's going to be given away. But if you want it early and you want to support the work, then all contributions gratefully received.
Brilliance, absolute brilliance. For my part, of course, you can find me knocking around the Exaggerated Elegy channel on YouTube quite a lot these days. You can find my latest short story collection, Essential Atrocities, over on Amazon, and there you will find lots and lots of bits and pieces over at strangeplaygrounds.com, articles, reviews, bits of short fiction, and whatnot. So thank you, Kit, so much for that conversation. It was brilliant.
No, thank
Absolute
you.
Brilliance.
I know it's been this one's been a few months in the off, and I'm so happy. Well worth the wait.
Oh, brilliance! Absolute brilliance! And thank you all for listening to us. Please go and read it, for God's sake. Please go and read this book. Just read it and come back to us. Tell us what you found from it. Tell us what you think from it. I don't know whether you can hear. That's my cat protesting because I'm apparently up beyond our bedtime. So, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, bye-bye.